The summer of 1987 had been particularly brutal at number 4 Privet Drive. 7-year-old Harry Potter pressed himself deeper into the shadows of his cupboard under the stairs, listening to Uncle Vernon's voice thunder through the thin wooden door like an approaching storm. The boy had learned to read the subtle variations in his uncle's rage. This wasn't the usual irritation about burnt toast or a neighbor's comment about their peculiar nephew. This was the dangerous kind, the kind that left bruises hidden beneath Harry's too large clothes. Where are you watching this story from today? Let me know in the comments below, because I love hearing from viewers all around the world who connect with these tales of what might have been. The floorboards above groaned under Vernon's considerable weight as he paced the living room, his voice carrying that particular edge that made Harry's stomach clench with familiar dread. Something about abnormality, about keeping things quiet, about making sure the boy understood his place. The words filtered through the walls like poison, each syllable designed to remind Harry that he was unwanted, unwelcome, a burden that existed solely at the sufferance of his reluctant guardians. Harry had grown accustomed to being called freak, to being told he was lucky they hadn't thrown him out on the street where he belonged. At 7 years old, he possessed a vocabulary of self-loathing that would have concerned any reasonable adult. But there were no reasonable adults in Harry's world, only the Dursleys with their careful cruelty and their endless reminders that normal people didn't want him around. The cupboard door rattled as Vernon's fist connected with it, making Harry flinch despite himself. The boy had learned not to cry out, not to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had frightened him. Fear was weakness, and weakness invited more punishment. Instead, he pressed his small hands against the rough wooden walls of his prison, feeling for the familiar gouges his fingernails had carved during previous episodes of imprisonment. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Vernon's rage carried an undertone of genuine panic, as if something had shaken the foundation of his carefully constructed normalcy. Harry caught fragments through the door, words about letters and people asking questions, and the need to make sure certain things stayed buried. The boy's unnaturally sharp mind, honed by years of hypervigilance, catalogued every inflection, every pause, every telling emphasis. The shouting continued for what felt like hours, though Harry's understanding of time remained frustratingly imprecise in the windowless confines of his cupboard. Aunt Petunia's voice joined the symphony of domestic discord, her words sharper than Vernon's, but somehow more desperate. She spoke of keeping up appearances, of what the neighbors might think, of responsibilities they had never wanted, but couldn't escape. Dudley's whimpering provided the soundtrack's final movement, the spoiled boy unused to witnessing his parents' fury, directed at anything other than his cousin. Harry felt a moment of bitter satisfaction at his cousin's discomfort, though he immediately pushed the feeling away. Such thoughts were dangerous, leading down paths that made peculiar things happen, things that brought even worse punishment than usual. The house fell silent with the abruptness of a slammed door. Harry waited, counting his heartbeats, measuring the spaces between Vernon's heavy footsteps as they retreated upstairs. Only when he heard the master bedroom door close did the boy allow himself to relax slightly, though true rest remained impossible in his cramped quarters. It was then, in that moment between vigilance and exhaustion, that Harry noticed something wrong with his left hand. A thin line of blood traced across his palm where he had pressed against the cupboard wall, the result of a particularly sharp splinter that had pierced his skin without his notice. The pain was minor, barely registering against the constant ache of hunger and cramped muscles, but something about the blood itself seemed strange. In the dim light that filtered through the cupboard's gaps, the crimson drops appeared to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Harry had seen his own blood before, scraped knees and accidental cuts being inevitable parts of childhood. But this felt different somehow. The blood seemed almost warm against the cool wood, spreading in patterns that defied simple physics. Where the blood touched the wall, Harry could swear he saw something shifting beneath the surface. The wood grain itself appeared to ripple, as if responding to some unseen force. The boy blinked hard, certain he was imagining things, but the strange phenomenon persisted. If anything, it grew stronger, the wall seeming to pulse with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Acting on an instinct he couldn't explain, Harry pressed his bleeding palm firmly against the spot where the wood seemed most responsive. The reaction was immediate and extraordinary. A section of the cupboard wall, no larger than a dinner plate, began to glow with a soft golden light. The illumination revealed details Harry had never noticed in his confined space, intricate patterns carved into the wood that had been invisible in the darkness. The glowing section of wall slid aside, with the whisper, quiet precision of well-oiled machinery, revealing a hidden compartment that defied the cupboard's modest dimensions. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be red velvet that had somehow maintained its rich color despite years of concealment, sat an ornate wooden box no larger than a jewelry case. Harry's breath caught in his throat as he reached for the box with trembling fingers. The moment his skin made contact with its surface, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with recognition. This box knew him, had been waiting for him, had somehow called to his blood through years of concealment. The box opened at his touch, revealing contents that would shatter everything Harry thought he knew about his life. 3 items lay within the velvet-lined interior, each one representing a different aspect of the lies that had shaped his existence. A letter bearing his mother's handwriting, a formal document with official seals, and a crystal that pulsed with captured light. Harry lifted the letter first, his young eyes struggling to make sense of the elegant script in the dim light. But as he focused on the words, they seemed to glow slightly, becoming legible despite the poor conditions. The letter was addressed to him, written in a hand he had never seen, but somehow recognized, with the certainty that came from deeper knowledge than memory. "My dearest Harry," the letter began, and already tears were forming in the boy's eyes. "If you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong with our plans. Your father and I made arrangements for your care, specific instructions that were meant to ensure your safety and happiness. If you have found this box, it means those arrangements have been betrayed." The letter continued, each word a revelation that rebuilt Harry's understanding of his world. His parents had not been the irresponsible drunks Vernon described, killed in a car crash brought on by their own recklessness. They had been murdered, victims of a dark wizard whose name made even the letter's magical ink seem to recoil. More importantly, they had made careful provisions for Harry's care, naming guardians who would love him and protect him. Sirius Black was to have been his guardian, a man his father trusted above all others. Remus Lupin would have provided education and guidance. Frank and Alice Longbottom were designated as backup guardians should anything happen to the primary choices. Nowhere in the carefully detailed instructions did Harry find any mention of the Dursleys, no provision for placing him with relatives who viewed his very existence as an affront to their rigid normalcy. The formal document proved even more damaging to the lies Harry had been fed. James Potter's will, bearing official seals and witness signatures, laid out explicit instructions for Harry's upbringing. Financial provisions had been made, educational trusts established, and detailed guidelines provided for ensuring Harry grew up knowing his heritage and understanding his parents' sacrifice. But most devastating of all was the final item in the box. The crystal, when Harry lifted it with shaking hands, projected images into the air above it with startling clarity. He watched, transfixed, as 2 figures materialized in miniature before him. One was an elderly man with a long white beard and twinkling eyes. The other, a stern woman in emerald robes with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. The bearded man was speaking, his words carrying clearly despite the crystal's small size. Albus Dumbledore, though Harry didn't yet know the name, was explaining his decision to override James Potter's will. The boy would be better served by hardship, the man argued, than by the love his parents had intended for him. Necessary suffering would prepare Harry for the challenges ahead, make him properly grateful for any kindness shown. McGonagall's objections were clear and passionate, but Dumbledore dismissed them with patronizing patience. The blood protection would be stronger if Harry truly had nowhere else to go, he explained. And besides, growing up among Muggles would keep him humble. The Potter fortune could wait, controlled by trustees who understood the greater good better than a child ever could. Harry watched in growing horror as the two figures discussed his fate with the casual indifference of people arranging furniture. His entire life, his suffering, his isolation, all of it had been deliberately orchestrated by a man who claimed to act in Harry's best interests, while ensuring those interests never took precedence over his own mysterious agenda. The crystal's projection faded, leaving Harry alone with knowledge that fundamentally altered his understanding of everything. He wasn't unwanted because he was inherently unlovable. He wasn't with the Dursleys because there had been no other option. He was trapped in this cupboard, enduring daily cruelty and systematic dehumanization, because an old man with a white beard had decided it would serve some greater purpose. The rage that filled Harry in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the helpless anger of a child facing adult cruelty, but something far more focused and dangerous. This was the fury of someone discovering they had been deliberately betrayed, systematically lied to, and condemned to suffering for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or necessity. But even as the anger threatened to consume him, another part of Harry's mind was already working, analyzing what he had learned and beginning to formulate a response. The boy who had learned to survive by anticipating his guardian's moods, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the motivations behind adult actions, now turned that same analytical prowess toward a much larger target. If Dumbledore had the power to override his parents' will, to place him with the Dursleys despite their obvious unsuitability, then Dumbledore was clearly a figure of significant authority in whatever world his parents had inhabited. The crystal's projection suggested this had been a calculated decision, not a moment of poor judgment, which meant the old man was both intelligent and ruthless. But Dumbledore had made one critical error in his calculations. He had assumed Harry would remain ignorant of the truth, that the boy would never discover the careful manipulations that had shaped his life. The blood ward that had protected the box under the stairs suggested there were aspects of Harry's heritage that even Dumbledore didn't fully understand or control. Harry carefully returned the items to their velvet-lined compartments, his young mind already beginning to form the outline of a plan. He was 7 years old, with no resources, no allies, and no clear understanding of the magical world he was apparently part of. But he had something Dumbledore couldn't have anticipated: complete clarity about who his real enemy was. The old man expected gratitude, counted on Harry's ignorance and dependency to maintain control. But the boy sitting in the cupboard under the stairs was no longer the broken, compliant victim Dumbledore's plan required. He was James Potter's son, heir to whatever legacy his parents had intended, and he had just discovered that legacy had been stolen from him. Harry pressed the blood-warded panel closed, watching as it sealed seamlessly back into the cupboard wall. The box and its contents were safe, protected by magic he didn't understand, but could somehow feel responding to his presence. More importantly, they represented proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the magical world. The house above remained quiet, the Dursleys presumably asleep after their evening's entertainment. But Harry knew that sleep would not come easily for him tonight, if at all. His mind was too full of revelations, too busy processing the implications of what he had learned and beginning to map out possible responses. 7 years old or not, Harry Potter was no longer content to be a victim. Someone had stolen his life, condemned him to suffering for their own purposes, and expected him to remain grateful for the privilege. But the blood that had opened the hidden compartment carried more than just Potter genetics. It carried the memory of parents who had loved him enough to make provisions for his happiness, and the determination of a child who refused to let their sacrifice be meaningless. Somewhere in the magical world, Albus Dumbledore was sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that his carefully laid plans remained on track. He had no way of knowing that his greatest miscalculation had just awakened to the truth, or that the boy he had written off as manageable was already beginning to plot his downfall. The summer of 1987 was about to become far more interesting than anyone had anticipated. Harry Potter had discovered that his life was a lie, but more importantly, he had discovered that lies could be exposed, conspiracies could be unraveled, and even the most powerful wizards were vulnerable to the consequences of their choices. In the darkness of his cupboard, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal that stretched back to his earliest memories, Harry Potter began to plan his revenge. And for the first time in his young life, he smiled with genuine anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. The transition from courtroom victory to establishing a genuine home represented challenges that Harry Potter had never imagined when his desperate search for truth first began in the cupboard under the stairs. 3 weeks had passed since Sirius Black's exoneration, and the complex process of building a family relationship while maintaining the momentum of institutional reform required skills that neither Harry nor his godfather had been prepared to develop under normal circumstances. The house that Sirius had chosen for their new beginning was neither the ancestral Black family mansion, with its dark history, nor a completely unfamiliar location that would provide no connection to their shared past. Instead, he had selected a comfortable cottage in the countryside that offered both security and the space necessary for Harry to continue his advocacy work while beginning the long process of healing from years of systematic abuse. Harry's adjustment to life with Sirius required careful navigation of expectations and boundaries that neither participant fully understood. The boy had learned to survive through hypervigilance and strategic thinking that made genuine relaxation difficult, while Sirius possessed memories of the infant Harry that bore little resemblance to the sophisticated political advocate his godson had been forced to become. The challenge of establishing normal family routines was complicated by the reality that both Harry and Sirius had been shaped by experiences that were anything but normal. Years of wrongful imprisonment had affected Sirius's ability to trust institutions and authority figures, while Harry's systematic abuse had created defensive mechanisms that sometimes interfered with his capacity to accept genuine care and affection. But perhaps most significantly, both recognized that their reunion was taking place in the context of ongoing political struggles that required continued attention and strategic thinking. The victory in Sirius's case had established important precedents while exposing the scope of institutional manipulation, but achieving lasting reform would require sustained effort that went far beyond individual vindication. The formal magical education that Harry began under Sirius and Remus Lupin's guidance revealed both the extent of his natural abilities and the degree to which his development had been systematically suppressed through years of deliberate intervention. The exercises that should have challenged someone much older proved manageable for Harry, suggesting that his magical potential had always been extraordinary, but had been artificially constrained through external manipulation. Sirius's approach to teaching reflected his understanding that Harry needed education that went beyond simple spell casting to encompass magical theory, political strategy, and the complex relationships that governed interactions between different magical communities. The curriculum was designed not only to prepare Harry for eventual attendance at Hogwarts, but to ensure that he possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to continue his advocacy work effectively. Remus Lupin's contributions to Harry's education proved particularly valuable in areas of magical theory and historical context that helped explain the institutional patterns they had been challenging. His scholarly background provided perspective on how similar reform movements had succeeded or failed throughout magical history, offering strategic insights that could guide their ongoing efforts. But perhaps most importantly, both Sirius and Remus recognized that Harry's education needed to accommodate his existing political commitments while providing the foundation for whatever future role he chose to pursue. The boy who had already achieved significant institutional reform deserved educational opportunities that respected his proven capabilities while addressing areas where formal instruction could enhance his natural talents. Harry's relationship with the broader magical community continued to evolve as news of his victory spread throughout wizarding society and beyond. Letters of support arrived daily from individuals and organizations who had been inspired by his example to examine their own experiences with institutional manipulation, creating a network of potential allies that extended far beyond his original goblin connections. The international attention that Harry's case was receiving created opportunities for collaboration on reform efforts that transcended national boundaries, while also generating pressure for comprehensive implementation of the precedents that had been established. Representatives from various foreign magical governments expressed interest in learning from the British experience, while contributing their own insights about institutional accountability and individual protection. The foundation that Harry established for child advocacy in the wizarding world represented his commitment to ensuring that the precedents achieved through his personal struggle would continue to protect future victims of institutional manipulation. The organization was structured to operate independently of government oversight, while maintaining the resources and expertise necessary to challenge even powerful figures who might attempt to abuse their authority. The financial resources that supported the foundation came primarily from the settlement that had been negotiated as part of the civil proceedings against Dumbledore, creating a direct connection between accountability for past crimes and protection for future victims. The arrangement ensured that those who had profited from systematic manipulation would contribute to preventing similar abuses while providing sustainable funding for ongoing advocacy efforts. Harry's role in the Foundation's operations reflected his understanding that achieving lasting change required institutional frameworks that could operate effectively regardless of changes in political leadership or public attention. The organization was designed to attract and develop advocacy expertise while maintaining the independence necessary to challenge authority when institutional failures occurred. The strategic planning for Harry's eventual attendance at Hogwarts required careful consideration of the complex dynamics that his presence would create within the school's existing power structures. Dumbledore's continued position as headmaster, despite the legal consequences he faced, meant that Harry would be entering an environment where his primary opponent retained significant influence and authority. Sirius and Remus's approach to preparing Harry for this challenge involved both practical education about navigating hostile institutional environments and strategic thinking about how to maintain his advocacy efforts while completing his formal magical education. The goal was to ensure that Harry could achieve his educational objectives without compromising either his personal safety or his ongoing reform work. But perhaps most importantly, they recognized that Harry's attendance at Hogwarts would provide opportunities to demonstrate the practical benefits of the reforms that had been achieved while inspiring other students to question institutional authority when it failed to serve their legitimate interests. Harry's presence could serve as a catalyst for broader cultural change that went beyond formal policy reforms to encompass fundamental shifts in how young witches and wizards understood their rights and responsibilities. The relationship between Harry's personal healing and his continued political advocacy required careful balance as both Sirius and Remus worked to provide the emotional support that years of systematic abuse had denied him, while respecting his commitment to ongoing reform efforts. The challenge was creating space for genuine childhood experiences while acknowledging that Harry's political sophistication and institutional responsibilities were real and important aspects of his identity. Harry's work with the Goblin community during this period expanded beyond the original financial investigations to encompass broader questions of interspecies relations and the structural inequalities that characterized interactions between different magical communities. His unique position as someone who had successfully challenged wizarding institutional authority while maintaining respectful relationships with Goblin representatives created opportunities for dialogue that could address long-standing sources of tension. The political ramifications of Harry's continued advocacy were becoming apparent as other cases of institutional manipulation began receiving attention that might not have been possible without the precedents his struggle had established. Families who had suffered financial abuse, children who had been placed in inappropriate situations, and individuals who had been denied legal protections were finding that the frameworks Harry had helped create provided viable paths to justice. But the success of these broader reform efforts also created new challenges, as those whose interests depended on maintaining existing power structures began developing more sophisticated strategies for resistance. The opposition that emerged was more organized and better funded than the initial responses to Harry's case, requiring continued vigilance and strategic adaptation from reform advocates. Harry's personal development during this crucial period reflected his growing understanding of the complex relationships between individual healing, family reconstruction, and ongoing social responsibility. The boy who had been forced to mature rapidly under circumstances of systematic abuse was now learning to balance legitimate childhood needs with genuine political commitments in ways that honored both aspects of his identity. The magical abilities that Harry demonstrated during his training with Sirius and Remus continued to reveal the extraordinary nature of his suppressed potential, while also raising questions about the responsible development of such significant power. The protective magic that had preserved his evidence and resisted Dumbledore's manipulation attempts suggested inherited capabilities that required careful guidance to develop safely and ethically. The broader magical community's response to Harry's continued prominence revealed ongoing divisions about the appropriate scope of individual rights and institutional accountability. While his personal story commanded widespread sympathy and respect, the systematic reforms that had resulted from his advocacy created changes that some viewed as potentially destabilizing to traditional authority structures. These political tensions required Harry to develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of alliance building and strategic communication as he worked to maintain support for ongoing reform efforts while building bridges with those who had legitimate concerns about rapid institutional change. His ability to articulate principled positions while acknowledging valid complexities impressed even experienced political observers. The international collaboration that emerged from Harry's case created opportunities for comparative analysis of institutional accountability mechanisms across different magical communities, while also providing examples of successful reform strategies that could be adapted to various cultural and political contexts. The precedents being established were beginning to influence policy discussions far beyond the specific circumstances that had originally motivated them. Harry's relationship with his extended family and community connections began to develop as the protective isolation that had characterized his early childhood gave way to broader social engagement. The process of building these relationships required careful attention to security considerations, while also ensuring that Harry's continued political activities didn't create risks for those who supported him. The Foundation's early projects demonstrated both the effectiveness of the advocacy frameworks that had been established and the continuing need for institutional vigilance as new cases of manipulation and abuse came to light. Each successful intervention reinforced the precedents that Harry's case had established, while also revealing additional areas where reform efforts needed to be expanded or strengthened. Harry's preparation for the broader challenges that lay ahead reflected his growing understanding that the victory in his personal case was just the beginning of a longer campaign for institutional accountability and individual protection throughout magical society. The precedents had been established, the frameworks were operational, and the political momentum existed to achieve lasting change. But sustaining these gains would require continued effort and strategic thinking. The vision for reform that Harry articulated during this period encompassed not only the correction of past injustices, but the creation of institutional cultures that prioritized individual welfare and transparent accountability. His understanding of systemic change had evolved far beyond simple policy modifications to encompass fundamental shifts in how magical communities approached questions of power and responsibility. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy in a blood-warded compartment was now positioned as a leader of comprehensive social change whose influence extended throughout the magical world. But perhaps more importantly, he had learned to balance the responsibilities that came with such influence against the legitimate needs of someone who was still, despite everything, 7 years old and deserving of childhood experiences that had been systematically denied to him. As Harry reflected on how completely his life had changed since that first desperate night when accidental magic had revealed the truth about his circumstances, he understood that the most important transformations were yet to come. The institutional frameworks were in place, the legal precedents were established, and the political momentum existed to achieve lasting reform. But the real work of building a magical society that prioritized individual dignity and institutional accountability was only beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the reform movement entered its next phase. But Harry possessed both the capabilities and the support network necessary to continue pursuing justice regardless of whatever obstacles might emerge. The foundation had been established for changes that could benefit countless future generations, and Harry was committed to ensuring that those changes would be sustained and strengthened through continued vigilance and strategic advocacy. The war for truth and accountability had evolved from desperate personal necessity into comprehensive social movement, and Harry Potter was ready to lead that movement toward whatever victories lay ahead. The intensive magical training that dominated Harry Potter's days during the months leading up to his eventual Hogwarts attendance reflected both the extraordinary nature of his abilities and the complex political environment he would soon be entering. 6 months had passed since Sirius's exoneration, and the boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy in a cupboard under the stairs was now preparing to enter the very institution where his primary adversary still held considerable power and influence. Sirius's approach to Harry's magical education was shaped by hard-earned understanding of the dangers that awaited anyone who challenged entrenched institutional authority without adequate preparation. The training regimen he established went far beyond simple spell casting to encompass advanced defensive magic, strategic thinking, and the complex political skills that Harry would need to navigate hostile environments while maintaining his advocacy efforts. The defensive magic that Harry mastered during this period built upon the protective capabilities he had demonstrated during his confrontation with Dumbledore, developing them into comprehensive defensive systems that could counter a wide range of potential threats. The exercises were demanding and sometimes dangerous for someone his age, but Harry's natural abilities and fierce determination allowed him to achieve proficiency that impressed even Sirius and Remus. But perhaps most importantly, Harry's training emphasized the ethical principles that should govern the use of magical power, ensuring that his growing capabilities would be guided by moral frameworks that prioritized protection of others rather than personal advantage. The lessons learned from Dumbledore's systematic manipulation provided clear examples of how extraordinary abilities could be corrupted when divorced from principled consideration of individual welfare and institutional responsibility. Remus Lupin's contributions to Harry's education proved particularly valuable in areas of magical theory and historical analysis that provided context for understanding the patterns of institutional manipulation they had been challenging. His scholarly background offered insights into how similar reform movements had succeeded or failed throughout magical history, providing strategic guidance that could inform ongoing advocacy efforts. The curriculum that emerged from their collaborative efforts was unlike anything offered at traditional magical schools, combining advanced practical instruction with political analysis and ethical education that prepared Harry not simply to use magic effectively, but to understand his responsibilities as someone whose capabilities could influence the broader magical community's development. Harry's relationship with the goblin community during this period evolved beyond the original financial investigations to encompass comprehensive education in magical law, international relations, and the complex treaties that governed interactions between different magical communities. Ragnarok's personal involvement in Harry's training reflected both respect for what the boy had achieved and investment in ensuring that his continued development would benefit broader reform efforts. The Goblin perspective on magical education emphasized practical application and ethical accountability in ways that complemented the theoretical foundations that Sirius and Remus were providing. The combination created an educational experience that was both intellectually rigorous and practically relevant to the challenges Harry would face as he continued his advocacy work while completing his formal schooling. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's Goblin education included comprehensive training in financial management and institutional oversight that would serve him well as he assumed greater responsibility for the Reform Foundation and its expanding operations. The skills he developed during this period went far beyond personal financial literacy to encompass understanding of how economic systems could be used to advance social justice or perpetuate institutional inequality. The strategic planning for Harry's attendance at Hogwarts required careful consideration of multiple objectives that needed to be balanced against significant risks and potential complications. The goal was not simply to complete his magical education, but to demonstrate the practical benefits of the reforms that had been achieved while inspiring other students to question institutional authority when it failed to serve their legitimate interests. Dumbledore's continued position as headmaster, despite the legal consequences he had faced, created an environment where Harry's presence would inevitably generate political tension and potential conflict. But rather than avoiding this confrontation, Harry and his advisors chose to view it as an opportunity to demonstrate that institutional accountability could be maintained even in settings where traditional authority structures remained largely intact. The preparations for this challenge included detailed analysis of Hogwarts's governance structures, student body composition, and the various political factions that influenced decision-making within the school community. Harry's allies conducted extensive research into potential supporters and opponents among both students and faculty, creating intelligence that would guide his strategic approach to building influence within the institution. More importantly, Harry's preparation included development of communication strategies that would allow him to articulate his reform agenda in ways that resonated with different audiences, while maintaining consistency with the principled positions he had established through his previous advocacy efforts. The challenge was presenting complex institutional issues in terms that would be accessible to his fellow students, while avoiding oversimplification that might undermine the seriousness of the reforms being promoted. Harry's work with the broader magical community during this period expanded to include collaboration with reform advocates in other countries whose own efforts had been inspired by the precedents established through his case. The international dimension of these relationships provided both strategic support and comparative perspective that enhanced understanding of how institutional accountability mechanisms could be adapted to different cultural and political contexts. The correspondence that Harry maintained with advocates throughout the magical world revealed the extent to which his example had encouraged challenges to institutional manipulation in communities that had previously accepted such abuses as inevitable aspects of magical governance. The precedents established through his struggle were being applied to cases involving financial fraud, child protection failures, and various forms of governmental overreach that had affected multiple generations of magical citizens. But perhaps most significantly, these international collaborations were beginning to create frameworks for coordinated advocacy that could address institutional problems transcending national boundaries. The network that was developing around Harry's Reform Foundation represented the beginning of a comprehensive approach to magical governance that prioritized individual rights and institutional accountability across traditional political divisions. The Foundation's expanding operations required Harry to develop management and leadership skills that went far beyond his previous advocacy experience, while maintaining the principled approach that had characterized his original reform efforts. The organization was attracting talented advocates whose expertise complemented Harry's unique perspective as someone who had successfully challenged powerful institutional figures while maintaining moral authority. The cases that the Foundation was addressing demonstrated both the effectiveness of the legal frameworks that had been established and the continuing need for vigilance as new examples of institutional manipulation came to light. Each successful intervention reinforced the precedents that Harry's original case had created, while also revealing additional areas where reform efforts needed to be expanded or strengthened. Harry's personal development during this crucial period reflected his growing understanding of the complex relationships between individual capability, social responsibility, and the strategic requirements of sustained advocacy efforts. The boy who had been forced to mature rapidly under circumstances of systematic abuse was now learning to integrate legitimate personal needs with genuine political commitments in ways that honored both aspects of his evolving identity. The magical abilities that Harry continued to develop under intensive training revealed capabilities that went far beyond what even his experienced instructors had anticipated. The protective magic that had preserved his original evidence and resisted Dumbledore's manipulation attempts was evolving into comprehensive defensive systems that could counter threats from multiple sources while maintaining the ethical principles that governed their application. More importantly, Harry's magical development was beginning to reveal connections between his inherited abilities and broader questions about the responsible use of extraordinary power within democratic societies. The precedents being established through his training would influence how future generations of magically gifted individuals understood their obligations to use their capabilities for social benefit rather than personal advantage. The political environment that Harry would be entering at Hogwarts required careful analysis of the various factions and interest groups that influence decision-making within the school community. The student body included representatives from families whose positions on institutional reform varied considerably, creating opportunities for building coalitions while also generating potential sources of opposition that would need to be managed strategically. Harry's approach to these complex political dynamics emphasized building genuine relationships based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than attempting to manipulate others through the kinds of techniques that Dumbledore had used to maintain power. The goal was to demonstrate that effective leadership could be exercised without compromising ethical principles or exploiting others' vulnerabilities for strategic advantage. The faculty relationships that Harry would need to navigate presented additional challenges, as many teachers had long-standing connections to Dumbledore that might influence their responses to Harry's continued advocacy efforts. But the legal precedents that had been established created frameworks for accountability that even Dumbledore's allies would find difficult to ignore when institutional failures occurred. Harry's preparation for these complex interpersonal dynamics included training in conflict resolution and diplomatic communication that would allow him to address disagreements constructively while maintaining his commitment to institutional reform. The skills he developed during this period would serve him well not only at Hogwarts, but in whatever future roles his advocacy work might require. The broader magical community's response to Harry's continued prominence revealed ongoing evolution in public attitudes toward institutional accountability and individual rights. The precedents established through his case had encouraged other victims of manipulation to come forward while also creating political pressure for comprehensive implementation of the reforms that had been achieved. But the success of these reform efforts had also generated more sophisticated opposition from those whose interests depended on maintaining traditional power structures. The resistance that was emerging required continued strategic adaptation from Harry and his allies as they worked to protect the gains that had been achieved while building momentum for additional changes. Harry's understanding of these complex political dynamics reflected his evolution from individual victim-seeking personal justice to strategic leader of comprehensive social change whose influence extended throughout the magical world. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy was now positioned to guide institutional transformation that could benefit countless future generations. The vision for reform that Harry articulated during this period encompassed not only the correction of specific injustices, but the creation of cultural frameworks that prioritized individual dignity and transparent accountability as fundamental principles of magical governance. His approach to these challenges demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how systematic change could be achieved through patient alliance building and strategic communication. The international recognition that Harry's advocacy work was receiving created opportunities for collaboration on reform efforts that transcended national boundaries, while also generating expectations that his continued efforts would maintain the high standards he had established through his original case. The precedents being created were beginning to influence policy discussions throughout the magical world. Harry's preparation for the challenges ahead reflected his growing understanding that the reforms achieved through his personal struggle represented just the beginning of a longer campaign for institutional accountability that would require sustained effort and strategic thinking. The frameworks were established, the precedents were clear, and the political momentum existed to achieve lasting change. But protecting and expanding these gains would demand continued vigilance. The Foundation's strategic plan for the coming years encompassed both defensive measures to protect existing reforms and proactive initiatives to expand accountability mechanisms into additional areas of magical governance. The organization that Harry had established was positioned to influence institutional development long after his personal involvement in day-to-day advocacy might change due to educational or career considerations. Harry's relationship with Sirius and Remus had evolved during this intensive training period to reflect genuine partnership in advancing shared values rather than simple mentorship of a younger person by more experienced adults. The three of them had become collaborators in efforts that could reshape fundamental aspects of magical society, while maintaining the family bonds that had been so crucial to Harry's personal healing. The boy who had pressed bleeding hands against cupboard walls in desperate search for truth was now preparing to enter the institution, where his primary opponent still held power, armed with capabilities, allies, and strategic understanding that would allow him to continue his advocacy regardless of whatever obstacles he might encounter. The training was complete, the preparations were finished, and Harry Potter was ready for the next phase of his campaign for justice and accountability. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the reform movement prepared for its most complex phase. But Harry possessed both the individual capabilities and institutional support necessary to pursue lasting change, regardless of whatever opposition might emerge. The precedents had been established, the frameworks were operational, and the momentum existed to achieve comprehensive transformation of how magical institutions approached questions of power and responsibility. The war for truth and accountability was entering its most crucial stage, and Harry Potter was ready to lead that effort toward whatever victories lay ahead. The September morning when Harry Potter first stepped onto the Hogwarts Express represented far more than simply another student beginning their magical education. The boy who had discovered evidence of systematic conspiracy in a blood-warded compartment under the Dursley stairs was now entering the institution, where his primary adversary still held considerable authority, armed with capabilities, allies, and strategic understanding that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of magical society's most important educational community. The transformation that Harry had undergone during the months since his first desperate discovery was visible to anyone with eyes to see. Gone was the broken, grateful victim that Dumbledore's manipulation had required, replaced by someone who possessed both the knowledge and the determination necessary to challenge institutional authority while maintaining principled commitment to justice and individual dignity. Harry's arrival at King's Cross Station created immediate disruption of the usual routines that characterized the beginning of each school year. Students and parents who recognized him from the extensive media coverage of his case found themselves witnessing not the famous boy who lived of popular mythology, but a sophisticated political advocate whose presence suggested that traditional power structures within magical education were about to face unprecedented challenges. The compartment that Harry chose on the train was selected not for privacy or social considerations, but for strategic positioning that would allow him to observe the various political dynamics among students while beginning the process of identifying potential allies and opponents within his peer group. The skills he had developed through months of complex political maneuvering were immediately applicable to the social environment of magical education. His first interactions with fellow students revealed both the extent of public awareness about his advocacy work and the complex range of reactions that his transformation had generated throughout magical society. Some approached him with curiosity and respect for what he had achieved, while others displayed wariness about the institutional changes his case had precipitated. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's presence was already inspiring other students to question authority and demand transparency in ways that would have been unthinkable before the precedents his case had established. Young witches and wizards who had previously accepted adult decisions without question were now asking pointed questions about institutional policies and demanding explanations for procedures that seemed arbitrary or unfair. The Sorting Hat's difficulty in placing Harry reflected the fundamental changes that his experiences had wrought in his character and capabilities. The boy who might once have been easily categorized according to traditional house characteristics now embodied qualities from all four houses through his unique journey from victim to advocate to strategic leader of comprehensive social reform. The Hat's extended deliberation created tension throughout the Great Hall as students, faculty and observers recognized that Harry's placement would carry symbolic significance far beyond simple educational categorization. The decision would be interpreted as commentary on his character, his methods, and his likely impact on the school community's future development. When the Sorting Hat finally announced Gryffindor, the choice reflected not simple courage, but the complex moral framework that had guided Harry's transformation from isolated victim to principled advocate for institutional accountability. The placement acknowledged his bravery while recognizing that his approach to challenging authority was guided by ethical considerations rather than simple rebellion or personal ambition. Harry's first night in Gryffindor Tower revealed both the opportunities and challenges that his presence would create within the school's existing social structures. His dormitory mates were clearly aware of his reputation and achievements, but translating that awareness into productive relationships required careful navigation of expectations and assumptions that had been shaped by media coverage and family discussions. The conversation that developed among the first-year Gryffindors during their initial evening together demonstrated Harry's ability to articulate complex political concepts in terms that were accessible to his peers, while maintaining consistency with the principled positions he had established through his advocacy work. His approach emphasized shared values and mutual respect rather than attempts to impose his perspectives through superior knowledge or political connections. But perhaps most importantly, Harry's interactions with his fellow students revealed his genuine interest in their individual experiences and perspectives rather than viewing them simply as potential allies or obstacles to his ongoing reform efforts. The boy who had been systematically isolated during his early childhood was now demonstrating remarkable social intelligence and empathy that enhanced his political effectiveness while reflecting authentic personal growth. The faculty's response to Harry's arrival created immediate complications for traditional power structures within the school community. Teachers who had long-standing relationships with Dumbledore found themselves navigating between loyalty to the headmaster and recognition that Harry represented legitimate concerns about institutional accountability that could no longer be dismissed or suppressed. Professor McGonagall's reaction to Harry's presence proved particularly significant, as her combination of respect for his achievements and concern about potential disruption to school routines reflected broader tensions within the magical education community about appropriate responses to the reforms that his case had precipitated. Her approach to managing these competing considerations would influence how other faculty members addressed similar challenges. The defense against the dark arts position, filled by Professor Quirrell, created additional complexity as Harry's advanced training in defensive magic quickly became apparent through classroom interactions. His capabilities exceeded not only those of his fellow students, but occasionally demonstrated knowledge that rivaled his instructor's expertise, creating pedagogical challenges that the school had never previously encountered. Harry's strategic approach to these classroom dynamics emphasized respectful collaboration rather than confrontational demonstration of superior abilities. His goal was to enhance the educational experience for all students while avoiding unnecessary conflict with faculty members who might feel threatened by his unconventional background and political influence. The impact of Harry's presence on student political awareness became apparent within days of the term's beginning, as conversations throughout the school increasingly focused on questions of institutional authority, individual rights, and the mechanisms necessary to ensure accountability from those in positions of power. The precedents established through Harry's case were being applied to student concerns about school policies and procedures. This political awakening among the student body created both opportunities and complications for school administration, as traditional methods of maintaining order through unquestioned authority became less effective when students possessed frameworks for challenging institutional decisions that seemed arbitrary or unfair. The changes were subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with previous patterns of student behavior. Harry's relationship with his peers evolved as initial curiosity about his fame gave way to genuine appreciation for his character and capabilities. The boy who had been systematically isolated was now discovering the pleasures of authentic friendship while learning to balance personal relationships with ongoing political commitments that extended far beyond school boundaries. The friendships that Harry developed during his first months at Hogwarts reflected his ability to connect with others across traditional social divisions within the magical community. His experiences with systematic manipulation had given him insights into human nature and institutional dynamics that allowed him to understand and appreciate perspectives that might seem contradictory or incompatible to others. But perhaps most importantly, Harry's approach to these relationships demonstrated that effective advocacy for social justice could be combined with genuine personal warmth and individual consideration for others' needs and concerns. The political sophistication that his circumstances had required him to develop was balanced by emotional intelligence that enhanced rather than undermined his ability to build meaningful connections. The academic challenges that Harry encountered at Hogwarts proved manageable given the intensive preparation he had received from Sirius, Remus, and his goblin instructors. But more significantly, his approach to learning emphasized understanding underlying principles rather than simply memorizing procedures, reflecting educational values that could enhance the experience for all students. Harry's contributions to classroom discussions frequently introduced perspectives and analytical frameworks that enriched the educational environment while demonstrating practical applications of theoretical concepts. His questions and observations encouraged both students and faculty to consider familiar subjects from new angles that revealed previously unexamined assumptions and implications. The transformation of Hogwarts' political environment accelerated as Harry's example inspired other students to take greater responsibility for their educational experience while demanding transparency and accountability from institutional authorities. The changes were gradual but persistent, creating momentum for reforms that would outlast individual personalities and political conflicts. The student government initiatives that emerged during Harry's first year reflected growing demand for meaningful participation in decisions that affected student welfare and educational quality. These developments represented practical application of the democratic principles that Harry's advocacy work had helped establish throughout magical society. Harry's relationship with Dumbledore within the school setting proved complex and carefully managed, as both participants understood that their conflict had evolved beyond personal antagonism to encompass fundamental questions about institutional authority and individual rights. The headmaster's continued position created ongoing tension, but the legal frameworks that had been established limited his ability to retaliate against Harry or suppress student political development. The interactions between Harry and Dumbledore that occurred during his first year were observed closely by both students and faculty as indicators of how the broader reform movement would influence traditional educational hierarchies. Harry's approach emphasized respectful but firm insistence on accountability and transparency, rather than personal attacks or attempts to undermine legitimate educational authority. But perhaps most importantly, Harry's presence at Hogwarts demonstrated that institutional reform could be achieved through persistent advocacy and principled resistance rather than requiring destructive confrontation or complete replacement of existing structures. The precedents being established would influence how future generations of students understood their rights and responsibilities within educational communities. The broader magical community's response to Harry's integration into Hogwarts revealed ongoing evolution in public attitudes toward institutional accountability and individual empowerment. The success of his transition from advocacy to education provided evidence that the reforms achieved through his case were sustainable and beneficial rather than disruptively radical. The international attention that Harry's educational experience continued to attract created opportunities for comparative analysis of educational governance across different magical communities, while demonstrating practical applications of accountability mechanisms that could be adapted to various cultural contexts. The precedents being established were influencing policy discussions throughout the magical world. Harry's work with the Child Advocacy Foundation continued during his time at Hogwarts, though necessarily adapted to accommodate his educational responsibilities and the unique environment of boarding school life. The Foundation's expanding operations demonstrated that sustainable institutional change required frameworks that could operate effectively, regardless of the specific involvement of founding personalities. The cases that the Foundation addressed during Harry's first year at school revealed both the effectiveness of established legal procedures and the continuing need for vigilance as new examples of institutional manipulation came to light. Each successful intervention reinforced precedents while expanding understanding of how accountability mechanisms could be applied to emerging challenges. Harry's personal development during this crucial period reflected his growing understanding of how individual capability, educational opportunity, and social responsibility could be integrated into a coherent approach to life that honored both personal needs and broader commitments to justice and institutional accountability. The balance he achieved would influence how future generations of advocates approached similar challenges. The magical abilities that Harry demonstrated during his first year at Hogwarts revealed continued development of the extraordinary capabilities that had been systematically suppressed during his early childhood. His progress exceeded expectations while maintaining the ethical frameworks that governed their application, providing examples of responsible power development that could guide others with similar potential. More importantly, Harry's magical education at Hogwarts was integrated with his ongoing political development in ways that demonstrated how individual empowerment could serve broader social good rather than simply advancing personal interests. The precedents being established would influence magical education throughout the community. The cultural changes that Harry's presence catalyzed within Hogwarts extended beyond political awareness to encompass broader shifts in how students understood their relationships with institutional authority and their responsibilities to protect individual rights within community settings. These developments represented fundamental changes in magical education that would have lasting impact. The vision for continued reform that Harry articulated during his first year at Hogwarts encompassed both the protection of gains that had been achieved and proactive expansion of accountability mechanisms into additional areas of magical governance. His approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how systematic change could be sustained through patient institution building and strategic communication. The alliances that Harry built during his time at school included relationships with students from various backgrounds whose perspectives enriched his understanding of how institutional reform could benefit different communities within magical society. The network that was developing would provide foundation for continued advocacy efforts, regardless of how his individual role might evolve over time. Harry's reflection on his transformation from the desperate child who had pressed bleeding hands against cupboard walls to the sophisticated advocate now influencing fundamental changes in magical education revealed both pride in what had been accomplished and determination to continue pursuing justice regardless of future challenges. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy was now positioned to guide institutional development that could benefit countless future generations. As Harry concluded his first year at Hogwarts and prepared for whatever new challenges lay ahead, he understood that the precedents established through his struggle would continue to influence magical society long after current political conflicts had been resolved. The frameworks for accountability were operational, the legal protections were established, and the cultural changes were sustainable. The institution that had once been dominated by unquestioned authority was now characterized by transparent governance and meaningful student participation in decisions affecting their educational experience. The transformation represented practical demonstration that individual courage and principled advocacy could achieve systematic change that honored both personal dignity and collective welfare. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to advance the cause of justice and institutional accountability, but Harry Potter possessed both the capabilities and the support necessary to continue that work, regardless of whatever obstacles might emerge. The war for truth and accountability had achieved decisive victories, and the precedents established would protect future generations from the kind of systematic manipulation that had once seemed inevitable. The boy who had been condemned to suffer for others' supposed greater good was now leading efforts to ensure that individual rights would never again be sacrificed for political convenience. The transformation was complete, the precedents were established, and the future of magical society had been fundamentally altered for the better. 3 days had passed since Harry Potter's world had fundamentally shifted on its axis, and the boy had not slept more than a few minutes at a time. Every moment the Dursleys weren't actively monitoring him, Harry found himself returning to the blood-warded compartment, studying the contents with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts. Each reading of his mother's letter revealed new details, subtle implications that painted an increasingly damning picture of his circumstances. The letter had become his lifeline and his weapon. 23 pages of careful script that detailed not just his parents' love, but their explicit instructions for his care. Lily Potter had possessed a methodical mind, leaving nothing to chance in her provisions for Harry's future. She had anticipated scenarios ranging from temporary guardianship to permanent adoption, financial considerations for his education, and even guidelines for explaining his magical heritage when he came of age. What she had never anticipated was complete betrayal by the very man she and James had trusted to execute their wishes. Albus Dumbledore appeared throughout the letter as a respected mentor and ally, someone whose wisdom could be counted upon in their darkest hour. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Harry that his mother's own words now served as evidence of the headmaster's treachery, but it was the discovery of additional documents hidden behind the letter that truly began to illuminate the scope of the conspiracy against him. Harry's small fingers had detected a subtle irregularity in the box's velvet lining, a slight thickness that suggested something more lay concealed beneath. When he pressed against the spot with the same blood that had opened the compartment initially, another hidden layer revealed itself. The financial record spread before him painted a picture of systematic theft that would have impressed the most accomplished criminals. Dumbledore had been accessing Potter family vaults at Gringotts Bank with disturbing regularity. Withdrawing substantial sums under the authority of documents Harry was now certain had been forged. The amounts were staggering to a 7-year-old who had never possessed so much as a pocket money allowance, but even Harry could understand that thousands of galleons represented serious wealth. More damaging still were the correspondence files that detailed Dumbledore's arrangements with the Dursleys themselves. Vernon and Petunia weren't just reluctant guardians grudgingly accepting an unwanted burden, they were paid contractors in Harry's systematic abuse. Monthly stipends had been promised and delivered, generous sums that explained how the Dursleys maintained their comfortable lifestyle despite Vernon's middling position at Grunnings. The letters between Dumbledore and Petunia revealed a calculated cruelty that left Harry struggling to process the implications. His aunt hadn't simply been following her natural inclinations toward nastiness. She had been explicitly instructed to ensure Harry remained isolated, desperate, and grateful for any scrap of kindness. Every cruel word, every missed meal, every night locked in his cupboard had been orchestrated as part of a larger plan to break his spirit and mold him into whatever Dumbledore required. Harry's transformation over those 3 days was visible even to his own eyes when he caught glimpses of his reflection in the box's polished interior. The haunted, defeated expression that had characterized his features for as long as he could remember was hardening into something far more dangerous. His green eyes, inherited from his mother, now burned with an intensity that would have concerned any adult perceptive enough to notice the change. But the Dursleys, secure in their assumption that Harry remained the cowering victim they had always known, failed to observe the subtle shifts in his behavior. They didn't notice how he had stopped flinching quite so dramatically at Vernon's raised voice, or how his responses to their casual cruelty had become more measured, calculated rather than reactive. Most importantly, they failed to recognize that Harry had stopped seeing them as all-powerful authorities and begun viewing them as what they truly were, willing accomplices in his systematic destruction. The boy's methodical nature, sharpened by years of hypervigilance, now turned toward documentation and evidence-gathering with remarkable sophistication for someone his age. Using a disposable camera he had liberated from Dudley's room during one of his cousin's rare absences, Harry began systematically photographing every document in the hidden compartment. The process required patience and careful timing, waiting for moments when the house's occupants were sufficiently distracted to risk the camera's telltale click. Each photograph was taken with exacting precision, ensuring that text remained legible and official seals clearly visible. Harry understood intuitively that these documents represented more than just proof of wrongdoing. They were weapons that could be deployed against his enemies when the proper moment arrived. But weapons required careful maintenance and strategic deployment, lessons he was learning through necessity rather than instruction. The challenge of concealing his activities while maintaining the appearance of the defeated child, the Dursleys expected, proved more complex than Harry had initially anticipated. Vernon and Petunia might not be particularly observant, but they possessed a keen instinct for detecting changes in Harry's demeanor that might suggest he was becoming less manageable. Any hint that their nephew was developing independence, or, worse still, hope, would bring immediate and severe consequences. So Harry learned to compartmentalize his existence in ways that would have impressed trained intelligence operatives. During the day, when the Dursleys were present and watchful, he maintained the facade of the broken boy they required. He flinched appropriately at Vernon's bellowing, kept his eyes downcast when Petunia delivered her casual cruelties, and accepted his meager meals with the grateful desperation they had trained him to display. But in the stolen moments when he was alone, Harry allowed his true nature to emerge. The fierce intelligence that had helped him survive now turned toward analysis and planning, breaking down the conspiracy against him into component parts and identifying potential vulnerabilities. The boy who had learned to anticipate his guardian's moods with uncanny accuracy now applied that same observational skill toward understanding the broader web of manipulation that surrounded him. It was during one of these analytical sessions that Harry made a discovery that changed everything he thought he understood about his own capabilities. Frustrated by the dim lighting in his cupboard that made reading difficult even with the document's subtle magical glow, he found himself wishing desperately for better illumination. The intensity of that wish, combined with the rage that constantly simmered beneath his careful facade, produced an unexpected result. Every light bulb in number 4 Privet Drive exploded simultaneously, creating a cascade of shattering glass and sudden darkness that sent the Dursleys into predictable hysterics. But Harry, sitting in his cupboard and staring at his hands in amazement, realized that the destruction hadn't been random or accidental. He had wanted light, had focused his desire with unusual intensity, and somehow that focus had manifested as electrical overload throughout the house's wiring system. The incident revealed capabilities that went far beyond the occasional bout of accidental magic that supposedly plagued magical children. This had been controlled, directed, and far more powerful than anything Harry had experienced before. More importantly, it suggested that his years of suppression and systematic abuse might have created pressure that was now seeking release in increasingly dramatic ways. Vernon's reaction to the electrical disaster provided Harry with valuable intelligence about the Dursleys' true understanding of their situation. Rather than simply raging about faulty wiring or demanding explanations, Vernon's first concern was ensuring the neighbors didn't ask awkward questions about the simultaneous failure of every bulb in the house. His panic suggested knowledge that went beyond simple suspicion, understanding rooted in specific warnings he had clearly received about Harry's potential capabilities. Petunia's response proved even more revealing. While Vernon blustered and complained about the cost of replacing the bulbs, she spent her time watching Harry with an expression that mixed fear, guilt, and something that might have been recognition. Her words were carefully chosen, references to abnormality, and the need to keep certain things under control that suggested she understood far more about Harry's heritage than she had ever admitted. It was then that Harry began to truly understand his aunt's role in the conspiracy against him. Petunia wasn't just a reluctant guardian accepting payment for an unpleasant duty. She was someone who possessed genuine knowledge about the magical world and had chosen to use that knowledge to facilitate Harry's systematic destruction. Her hatred wasn't born of ignorance, but of understanding, making her complicity infinitely more damning. The realization that his aunt knew exactly what she was doing, that every cruel word and deliberate neglect was calculated to achieve specific psychological effects, filled Harry with a fury that made his previous anger seem insignificant by comparison. But this rage was different from the helpless frustration that had characterized his earlier responses to abuse. This was cold, analytical, and absolutely focused on achieving concrete results. Harry began studying his guardians with the intensity of a predator, observing prey, cataloguing their habits, their fears, their weaknesses, with methodical precision. Vernon's obvious terror of anything that might disrupt his carefully maintained normalcy provided one avenue of potential leverage. Petunia's guilt, barely concealed beneath layers of manufactured justification, offered another. Even Dudley's spoiled nature could be turned to Harry's advantage if properly manipulated. But perhaps most importantly, Harry began to understand that his guardian's power over him was largely illusion maintained by his own compliance. They could hurt him, certainly, but they couldn't actually control him if he chose to resist. Their authority rested on his acceptance of their right to exercise it, and that acceptance was no longer guaranteed. The days following the light bulb incident established a new dynamic in the Dursley household, though one so subtle that its participants barely recognized the change. Harry continued to perform his assigned role as grateful victim, but now his compliance was strategic rather than genuine. He was gathering intelligence, testing boundaries, and preparing for actions that would fundamentally alter the balance of power. Vernon and Petunia, meanwhile, found themselves dealing with a nephew who seemed somehow different, without being able to identify exactly how. He was still appropriately deferential, still visibly grateful for their grudging care, but something in his demeanor suggested depths they had never noticed before. The change was troubling enough that Petunia had begun watching Harry with increased attention, though she couldn't articulate what she was looking for. It was during this period of escalating tension that Harry made his most disturbing discovery yet. Hidden in the very back of the document collection, beneath records and correspondence that had already shattered his understanding of his situation, lay a single sheet of parchment that bore his own name in official script. The document was a psychological evaluation, apparently conducted when he was barely 3 years old, that detailed his emotional state and developmental progress with clinical precision. The evaluation painted a picture of a bright, affectionate child who had been thriving under the care of temporary guardians following his parents' death. Harry learned that he had spent nearly 6 months with Frank and Alice Longbottom, who were described as loving, attentive caregivers who had helped him process his trauma and begin healing from his parents' loss. The boy described in those pages bore no resemblance to the broken creature he had become under Dursley care. More damaging still was the recommendation section, where the evaluating professional strongly advised against placing Harry with relatives who had previously expressed hostility toward his parents and their lifestyle. The Dursleys were specifically mentioned as unsuitable guardians, whose rigid attitudes and documented prejudices made them potentially harmful to a child already struggling with significant trauma. Dumbledore's handwritten notes in the margins revealed the true purpose of commissioning the evaluation. Rather than using the professional assessment to guide his placement decision, the headmaster had used it to identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited to achieve his desired outcome. Every positive trait mentioned in the report was accompanied by Dumbledore's speculation about how it could be systematically destroyed through appropriate environmental pressure. The clinical language couldn't disguise the monstrous nature of what Harry was reading. Dumbledore had deliberately chosen the placement most likely to damage him, specifically because that damage would serve the headmaster's larger purposes. The man who claimed to act in Harry's best interests had coldly calculated how to break a 3-year-old child's spirit, and then implemented that plan with methodical precision. Harry's reaction to this final revelation went beyond anger into something approaching transcendent rage. The boy who had learned to survive by suppressing his emotions now found those emotions demanding expression with volcanic intensity. But rather than exploding into the kind of tantrum that would have brought immediate punishment, Harry channeled that fury into clarity of purpose that was remarkable for someone his age. He was done being a victim, done accepting abuse as his natural lot in life, done believing that adults knew what was best for him when those same adults had systematically betrayed every trust placed in them. The document spread before him provided both the evidence of conspiracy and the roadmap for his response, and Harry Potter was ready to begin his war. The boy carefully returned the documents to their hidden compartments, but not before making one final addition to his collection. Using a pen stolen from Vernon's desk, Harry wrote his first letter as someone other than a victim. The recipient was someone he had never met, but now understood to be his rightful guardian, someone who had been denied the opportunity to fulfill his responsibilities by Dumbledore's machinations. "Dear Sirius Black," the letter began, and Harry found his hand remarkably steady as he continued. "I am James Potter's son, and I have discovered that you are my godfather. I have proof that you are innocent of the crimes you were accused of, and I have proof that Albus Dumbledore has been systematically stealing from my family and orchestrating my abuse. I need your help, but more than that, I think you need mine. We have enemies in common, and I believe we can help each other achieve justice." The letter was longer than anything Harry had ever written, filled with specifics about his situation and detailed references to the documents he had discovered. But more than that, it was the first communication Harry had ever initiated as an equal rather than a supplicant, someone offering alliance rather than begging for mercy. Harry sealed the letter in an envelope taken from Petunia's writing desk, addressing it with careful precision, though he had no clear idea how to deliver it to someone imprisoned in a wizard prison he had never heard of. But that was a problem for tomorrow, along with the 100 other challenges he would need to overcome to transform from victim to victor. Tonight, for the first time in his young life, Harry Potter went to sleep with a smile on his face and genuine hope in his heart. Tomorrow would begin his campaign for justice, and he was ready for whatever that campaign might require. The challenge of contacting Sirius Black while imprisoned in a wizard prison had occupied Harry's thoughts for nearly a week before inspiration struck in the most unlikely of places. Dudley's bedroom, a shrine to mediocrity decorated with the detritus of a spoiled childhood, contained something Harry had previously dismissed as irrelevant to his circumstances. The computer that Vernon had purchased for his son's education, though used primarily for primitive games and the occasional homework assignment, represented access to information that Harry was only beginning to understand. The Dursleys' paranoid insistence on maintaining the appearance of normalcy meant they subscribed to various publications and maintained memberships in organizations that reinforced their status as respectable suburban citizens. Among these was Vernon's largely ignored subscription to several business journals that occasionally referenced government operations, including the justice system. Harry had noticed references to something called the Ministry of Justice in various contexts, though he had initially assumed these were mundane government departments. But his mother's letter had mentioned a Ministry of Magic, and Harry's increasingly sophisticated understanding of his situation suggested that the magical world might maintain parallel institutions to those of the non-magical government. If there was a magical prison system, there might also be magical courts, magical law enforcement, and magical legal procedures that governed such matters as wrongful imprisonment. The computer proved surprisingly useful once Harry mastered its basic operations, a process that required careful timing to avoid detection by the Dursleys. Dudley's attention span for academic pursuits remained mercifully short, and Vernon's work schedule provided regular windows when the machine could be accessed without risk of discovery. Harry's research methodology, developed through years of seeking information while avoiding adult notice, translated well to navigating the primitive information systems available. What Harry discovered during his clandestine research sessions painted a picture of institutional corruption that extended far beyond his personal situation. References to unexplained prisoner transfers, closed hearings, and sealed records suggested a justice system that operated with minimal oversight or public accountability. More intriguingly, several articles referenced prisoners held without trial, their cases tied up in bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed to prevent rather than facilitate resolution. The breakthrough came when Harry discovered a reference to something called the Wizengamot in a legal publication that Petunia had brought home from her volunteer work with a local charity. The article was brief and largely incomprehensible, but it mentioned ancient procedures for challenging wrongful imprisonment that predated modern legal reforms. More importantly, it referenced the role of certain banking institutions in maintaining legal records that even government authorities couldn't access or modify. Gringotts Bank appeared in multiple contexts throughout Harry's research, always described in terms that suggested unusual independence from government oversight. The institution was mentioned as maintaining its own security forces, operating under treaties that granted them significant autonomy, and possessing record-keeping systems that dated back centuries. Most intriguingly, several references suggested that Gringotts had procedures for conducting business with clients who couldn't physically appear at their facilities, including prisoners and others restricted by legal circumstances. The implications were staggering. If Gringotts operated independently of the magical government, if they maintained records that couldn't be altered by even powerful wizards like Dumbledore, and if they had procedures for conducting business with imprisoned clients, then they might represent Harry's first potential ally in his campaign for justice. More than that, they might be the key to not only reaching Sirius, but also challenging the financial manipulations that had robbed him of his inheritance. Harry's letter to Gringotts required careful consideration of tone and content. He was 7 years old, writing to an institution he had never seen about matters he barely understood. But he needed to convey both the seriousness of his situation and his determination to see justice done. The language had to be formal enough to command respect, while remaining authentic to his age and circumstances. "Dear managers of Gringotts Bank," he began, writing in his most careful script on paper, stolen from Petunia's correspondence supplies. "My name is Harry James Potter, son of James and Lily Potter, and I believe that my family's accounts have been accessed illegally by someone who does not have proper authority. I have documents that prove this, and I would like to speak with someone who can help me understand my rights as the Potter heir." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing what Harry had discovered about the unauthorized withdrawals, while carefully avoiding specifics about how he had obtained the information. He mentioned his current living situation in general terms, describing himself as staying with relatives who were not his legal guardians according to his father's will, and expressed his desire to contact his rightful guardian, who had been prevented from fulfilling his responsibilities. Most importantly, Harry included copies of specific financial records that showed clear evidence of fraud, along with excerpts from his father's will that established his legal status as the Potter heir. The documents were photocopied using equipment at the local library during a carefully orchestrated expedition when Petunia had sent him to return overdue books, a task that provided perfect cover for his real purpose. The challenge of delivering the letter proved nearly as complex as composing it. Harry's research had revealed references to Owl Post as the primary communication method for the magical world, but he had no access to magical owls and no clear understanding of how such a system might work. Regular postal service seemed unlikely to reach a magical bank, assuming such an institution even maintained a conventional address. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Fig, the cat-loving neighbour who occasionally watched Harry when the Dursleys needed to go somewhere children weren't welcome, had always seemed unusually knowledgeable about topics that normal people shouldn't understand. Her casual references to unusual animals, her strange visitors who appeared and disappeared at odd hours, and her general eccentricity suggested connections to communities beyond suburban Surrey. Harry's approach to Mrs. Fig required delicate manoeuvring, as he couldn't simply ask direct questions about magical mail delivery without revealing knowledge he wasn't supposed to possess. Instead, he crafted a story about a school project on unusual postal systems around the world, claiming he needed information about historical methods of long-distance communication for a report he was supposedly writing. Mrs. Fig's reaction to Harry's carefully innocent questions confirmed his suspicions about her true nature. Rather than dismissing his inquiries as childish curiosity, she responded with detailed information about various communication methods that included references to trained birds, enchanted objects, and delivery services that operated outside normal government oversight. More tellingly, she offered to help him send a letter, using methods that would ensure it reached its intended recipient, regardless of their unusual circumstances. The conversation that followed represented Harry's first genuine negotiation as an equal participant, rather than a powerless child seeking adult assistance. Mrs. Fig clearly suspected that Harry's interest in alternative postal systems went beyond academic research, but rather than pressing for details she couldn't rightfully expect to receive, she offered assistance in exchange for simple honesty about his basic situation. Harry's decision to trust Mrs. Fig with edited version of his circumstances proved remarkably liberating. For the first time since discovering the hidden documents, he could discuss his situation with someone who possessed the knowledge to understand its implications. Mrs. Fig's reactions to his carefully chosen revelations confirmed both the seriousness of his situation and the validity of his planned response. The elderly woman's network of contacts proved both extensive and remarkably discreet. Within 2 days of their initial conversation, she had arranged for Harry's letter to be delivered to Gringotts through channels that bypassed normal postal systems entirely. More importantly, she had provided Harry with information about proper protocols for communicating with goblin institutions, including forms of address and cultural considerations that could mean the difference between respectful attention and dismissive rejection. The response from Gringotts arrived with startling efficiency, delivered by methods that Harry never fully observed, but which resulted in an envelope appearing in Mrs. Fig's garden, where she discovered it during her morning routine. The letter bore official seals and formal language that immediately established its legitimacy, but its contents exceeded even Harry's optimistic expectations for institutional support. Griphook, the goblin who had authored the response, acknowledged the serious nature of Harry's allegations while expressing the bank's concern about unauthorized access to Potter family accounts. More significantly, he confirmed that Gringotts maintained legal protocols for investigating financial irregularities that operated independently of wizarding government oversight, meaning that even powerful individuals like Dumbledore couldn't simply suppress inconvenient inquiries through political influence. The letter proposed a meeting at a neutral location, where Harry could present his evidence in person and receive proper legal advice about his options. Griphook suggested a specific park in London, that was easily accessible by public transportation, but sufficiently anonymous to avoid unwanted attention. The time and date were left for Harry to determine based on his ability to travel without arousing suspicion from his guardians. But perhaps most encouraging was Griphook's acknowledgement that similar concerns had been raised by other Goblin officials regarding Dumbledore's financial activities. The bank had been monitoring the situation, but required evidence from the affected party to initiate formal proceedings. Harry's letter provided exactly the authorization they needed to begin a comprehensive investigation into not only the Potter accounts, but potentially other instances of unauthorized access. The meeting with Griphook required careful planning and considerable courage from someone Harry's age. The journey to London represented his first independent travel beyond the immediate vicinity of Little Whinging, and the prospect of negotiating with a Goblin banker about complex financial matters would have intimidated adults with far more experience than Harry possessed. But the boy who had survived years of systematic abuse while maintaining both his sanity and his moral compass proved remarkably adaptable to new challenges. Harry's preparation for the meeting included researching Goblin cultural norms, practicing formal speech patterns that would command respect, and organizing his evidence in a manner that would facilitate productive discussion rather than confused explanations. The park where they met was carefully chosen for its combination of public accessibility and private conversation opportunities. Griphook's appearance initially startled Harry, as his previous exposure to non-human intelligence had been limited to pets and the occasional nature documentary. But the Goblin's professional demeanor and obvious competence quickly established a foundation for productive dialogue. Griphook's examination of Harry's evidence produced reactions that validated the boy's understanding of his situation while introducing complications he hadn't previously considered. The unauthorized withdrawals were clearly fraudulent, violating both wizarding law and the specific terms of James Potter's will. But the scope of Dumbledore's financial manipulation extended far beyond simple theft, encompassing a systematic effort to control Harry's resources and limit his options for independent action. More disturbing was Griphook's revelation that similar patterns of unauthorized access had been detected in other accounts associated with families that had opposed Voldemort during the recent war. The evidence suggested a coordinated effort to limit the financial independence of potential opposition while consolidating resources under Dumbledore's control. Harry's case wasn't an isolated incident of questionable judgment, but part of a larger pattern of institutional manipulation. The introduction of Ragnok, Griphook's superior, and a Goblin of considerable influence within the bank's hierarchy, marked a turning point in both the investigation and Harry's understanding of his situation's broader implications. Ragnok's experience with wizarding politics provided context for Dumbledore's actions, while revealing vulnerabilities that could be exploited to achieve justice. Ragnok explained that Goblins had been suspicious of Dumbledore's activities for years, but had been unable to act without explicit authorization from affected account holders. The wizard's political connections and carefully cultivated reputation for benevolence had protected him from official scrutiny, while his victims remained either ignorant of the manipulation or too intimidated to challenge his authority. But Harry's case was different in several crucial respects. His age made him a sympathetic figure whose mistreatment would generate public outrage if properly presented. His status as the boy who lived gave him political significance that even Dumbledore couldn't simply dismiss. Most importantly, his evidence was both comprehensive and impossible to explain away through the usual techniques of misdirection and political influence. The Goblin's offer of assistance went far beyond simple financial advice. Ragnok proposed a comprehensive investigation into Dumbledore's activities that would be conducted under Goblin law, which operated independently of wizarding government authority and couldn't be suppressed through political pressure. The investigation would be thorough, impartial, and conducted according to standards that prioritized evidence over reputation or political convenience. In exchange, Ragnok requested that Harry grant Gringotts exclusive authority to manage his financial affairs until he reached his majority, an arrangement that would both protect his inheritance from further manipulation and provide the bank with legal standing to pursue broader reforms in wizarding financial oversight. The terms were generous, offering Harry both protection and profit, while advancing goblin interests in establishing stronger legal precedents for their institutional independence. Harry's agreement to the proposed arrangement represented his first major decision as a political actor rather than a victim seeking assistance. The boy understood that he was entering into an alliance with beings whose interests aligned with his own, but whose ultimate goals extended far beyond his personal situation. But rather than being intimidated by the complexity of these relationships, Harry found himself energized by the opportunity to participate in efforts that could benefit others facing similar injustices. The contract signing ceremony, conducted according to goblin legal traditions that dated back centuries, marked Harry's formal transition from powerless victim to active participant in the wizarding world's power structures. The blood magic involved in sealing goblin contracts resonated with the same forces that had protected his hidden documents, suggesting connections between his magical heritage and the institutional protections he was now invoking. Ragnarok's explanation of the investigation's next phases revealed the thoroughness with which goblins approached matters of financial justice. Teams of specialists would examine every transaction associated with the Potter accounts, comparing authorization documents against established legal standards and identifying patterns of unauthorized access. Similar scrutiny would be applied to other accounts where suspicious activity had been detected, building a comprehensive case against Dumbledore's financial manipulations. But perhaps most significantly, the goblins would be investigating the legal basis for Harry's placement with the Dursleys, examining whether proper procedures had been followed and whether the arrangement served Harry's interests as required by wizarding child protection laws. This investigation had the potential to not only free Harry from his current circumstances, but also to establish legal precedents that would protect other children from similar manipulation. The meeting concluded with Harry possessing something he had never experienced in his young life: powerful allies who were committed to achieving justice on his behalf while respecting his agency and intelligence. The documents he had discovered in his cupboard had opened a door to a wider world where his suffering wasn't simply accepted as inevitable, but recognized as evidence of serious wrongdoing that demanded correction. Harry's journey back to Little Whinging was marked by a sense of anticipation rather than the dread that had characterized his previous returns to Privet Drive. The boy who had been systematically isolated and demoralized now possessed connections to institutions that could challenge even the most powerful figures in the wizarding world. More importantly, he had demonstrated to himself that he possessed both the intelligence and the courage necessary to navigate complex political waters while maintaining his integrity and advancing his legitimate interests. The Dursleys' evening routine proceeded without any indication that their nephew had spent the day fundamentally altering the balance of power that had previously defined their relationship. Vernon complained about his usual workplace irritations, while Petunia fussed over Dudley's minor accomplishments, neither of them recognizing that the boy they had systematically abused was no longer the helpless victim their arrangement with Dumbledore required. But Harry, sitting in his cupboard and reviewing the documents that had started his transformation, was already planning his next moves in a campaign that would ultimately expose the conspiracy against him while establishing protections for others who might face similar manipulation. The goblins had provided him with both the resources and the legal framework necessary to challenge Dumbledore's authority, but the real work of achieving justice was only beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities as the investigation moved forward and the scope of Dumbledore's manipulation became clearer. But tonight, Harry Potter went to sleep, knowing that he was no longer fighting alone, and that the evidence of his enemy's crimes was now in the hands of allies with both the power and the determination to see justice done. The discovery that changed everything came not through careful research or deliberate investigation, but through the kind of magical accident that seemed to follow Harry wherever his emotions ran strongest. 3 weeks had passed since his meeting with the goblins, and Harry had grown increasingly frustrated with the limited scope of the evidence at his disposal. The documents hidden in his cupboard told a damning story of financial manipulation and deliberate child abuse, but they revealed little about the broader conspiracy that had shaped his life from its earliest moments. It was during one of his regular examination sessions, when Harry was studying his mother's letter for what must have been the 100th time, that his desperate wish for more information triggered an unexpected magical response. The letter in his hands began to glow with the same golden light that had first revealed the hidden compartment, but this time the illumination spread beyond the parchment itself to encompass the entire blood-warded box. What emerged from that golden radiance was something Harry had never seen before, a second compartment that had remained hidden even from his previous blood magic discoveries. This new space contained materials that James Potter had clearly intended to remain concealed until his son possessed both the magical strength and emotional maturity to handle their contents safely. James Potter's private journal comprised nearly 200 pages of careful observations about the war against Voldemort, the politics of the wizarding world, and most damning of all, his growing suspicions about Albus Dumbledore's true motivations and methods. Written in the months leading up to his death, the journal painted a picture of a man gradually realizing that his most trusted mentor might represent a threat to everything he held dear. The early entries revealed James as an idealistic young man eager to serve the cause of justice under Dumbledore's guidance. But as the war progressed, and James gained access to more sensitive information through his role in the Order of the Phoenix, troubling patterns began to emerge. Missions that seemed designed to fail, intelligence that proved suspiciously inaccurate, and strategic decisions that consistently benefited Dumbledore's long-term positioning rather than the immediate goal of defeating Voldemort. Most significantly, James had documented his discovery of Dumbledore's manipulation of the Fidelius charm that was supposed to protect the Potter family. The secret keeper arrangement, which should have been a straightforward protective measure, had been deliberately complicated through Dumbledore's insistence on multiple layers of misdirection that served no obvious security purpose, but created numerous opportunities for betrayal. The journal revealed that James had originally intended to serve as his own secret keeper, an arrangement that would have made the protective charm nearly unbreachable. But Dumbledore had argued persuasively that such an arrangement would be too obvious to their enemies, suggesting instead that they use a trusted friend as a decoy while keeping the real secret keeper's identity hidden even from most Order members. Sirius Black had volunteered for the decoy role, understanding that his position would make him a target for Voldemort's forces, but believing that his sacrifice would help protect his best friend's family. The real secret keeper was to have been Peter Pettigrew, chosen specifically because his apparent cowardice and weak magical abilities would make him seem an unlikely candidate for such an important responsibility. But James's final entries revealed his growing suspicion that the entire arrangement had been orchestrated to ensure betrayal rather than prevent it. Dumbledore's insistence on the complex secret keeper switch, his careful positioning of Peter as the supposedly secret choice, and his failure to implement additional security measures that James had suggested all pointed toward a conspiracy designed to ensure the Potter family's vulnerability at a crucial moment. The journal's most devastating revelation came in James's final entry, written less than a week before his death. He had discovered evidence that Dumbledore had been in communication with Peter Pettigrew independently of the Order's official channels, meetings that had no obvious purpose related to the war effort, but which coincided with increased Death Eater activity in areas where the Order had planned operations. James had begun to suspect that Dumbledore wasn't simply making strategic errors or falling victim to Peter's treachery, but was actively orchestrating events to serve some larger purpose that required the Potter family's destruction. The prophecy that had made Harry a target wasn't just an unfortunate magical accident that had drawn Voldemort's attention, but a carefully manipulated revelation designed to create exactly the circumstances that ultimately led to Godric's Hollow. The implications were staggering and horrible. Dumbledore hadn't simply failed to protect Harry's parents, he had engineered their deaths as part of a larger plan that required Harry to survive while losing everything else. The blood protection that had saved Harry's life wasn't an unexpected magical accident, but a calculated outcome that Dumbledore had anticipated and planned to exploit. Harry's reaction to these revelations went beyond the anger and determination that had characterized his previous discoveries. This was betrayal on a scale that challenged his understanding of human nature itself. The man who claimed to represent the forces of good in the wizarding world had deliberately orchestrated the murder of Harry's parents for reasons that remained unclear, but were obviously connected to the systematic manipulation that had defined Harry's entire life. But perhaps even more devastating was the realization of Sirius Black's true situation. The man who should have been Harry's guardian hadn't betrayed the Potter family, but had been framed for crimes committed by the real traitor. Sirius had spent years in the wizard prison of Azkaban, enduring torments that Harry could barely imagine, not because he was guilty of the crimes attributed to him, but because his imprisonment served Dumbledore's purposes. The injustice was absolute and intolerable. An innocent man suffered in prison while his parents' real murderer lived free, protected by the same system that claimed to represent justice. Meanwhile, Harry had been deliberately placed with abusive guardians and systematically isolated from anyone who might challenge Dumbledore's control over his life and resources. Harry's magical response to these revelations was immediate and dramatic. Every piece of glass in number 4 Privet Drive shattered simultaneously, from the windows to the dishes to Dudley's collection of toy figurines. The Dursleys' screams of terror and confusion provided a soundtrack to Harry's transformation from victim to something far more dangerous. But this time, Harry's accidental magic wasn't simply an expression of uncontrolled emotion. The power that flowed through him carried purpose and direction, responding to his conscious will rather than simply reacting to his emotional state. Harry could feel the magic answering to his intentions, could sense its readiness to serve his commands in ways that went far beyond simple destruction. The boy who had spent years suppressing his magical abilities to avoid punishment now found himself capable of effects that would have impressed trained wizards decades older than himself. The glass hadn't simply broken randomly, but had shattered in patterns that avoided injuring anyone while making clear the scope of power at Harry's disposal. This wasn't an accident, but a demonstration, a warning to anyone who might be watching that Harry Potter was no longer the helpless victim they had assumed him to be. Vernon's reaction to the magical outburst revealed knowledge that Harry had suspected, but never confirmed. Rather than simply raging about property damage or demanding explanations, Vernon immediately began making phone calls that referenced previous incidents and promised authorities. His conversation suggested ongoing communication with people who understood exactly what Harry was capable of and were prepared to respond to escalating magical activity. Petunia's response proved even more revealing. She approached Harry with a combination of fear and guilt that suggested she understood the broader implications of what was happening. Her questions weren't about broken glass or property damage, but about Harry's emotional state and whether he had discovered things that adults had hoped would remain hidden. It was during this tense confrontation that Petunia made the admission that completed Harry's understanding of the conspiracy against him. She revealed that Dumbledore had indeed been in regular contact with the Dursleys throughout Harry's childhood, providing not just financial compensation for his care, but specific instructions about how that care should be administered to achieve desired psychological effects. The elderly wizard had been explicit about his requirements, Petunia explained with obvious reluctance. Harry was to be kept isolated from the magical world, grateful for any scraps of affection shown to him, and convinced of his own unworthiness. The abuse hadn't been simple neglect, or the Dursleys following their natural inclinations, but a carefully calibrated program designed to break Harry's spirit while maintaining his basic physical health. Dumbledore had provided detailed guidance about appropriate levels of deprivation, specific techniques for undermining Harry's self-confidence, and methods for ensuring that he would be desperate for adult approval when he finally entered the magical world. Every cruel word, every missed meal, every night locked in the cupboard had been prescribed by the man who claimed to be working in Harry's best interests. The revelation completed Harry's transformation from confused victim to focused antagonist. He now understood the full scope of the conspiracy against him, from the orchestrated murder of his parents to the systematic abuse of his childhood. More importantly, he understood that Dumbledore's power rested largely on his reputation for benevolence and his victim's ignorance of his true nature. Harry's decision to take direct action came not from rage, but from a cold calculation of justice and necessity. Sirius Black was innocent and had suffered years of wrongful imprisonment to serve Dumbledore's purposes. Other victims, both known and unknown, continued to suffer under a system that protected manipulative authority figures while silencing their victims. The situation demanded action that went beyond simply protecting Harry's own interests. The boy's first step was to contact Ragnok through the secure communication methods the Goblin had established. Harry's message was brief but comprehensive, outlining his new discoveries while requesting immediate expansion of the investigation to include not just financial crimes, but potential criminal conspiracy in the deaths of James and Lily Potter. Ragnok's response arrived within hours, carried by methods that bypassed both magical and mundane postal systems entirely. The Goblin's tone conveyed both shock at the scope of the revelations and determination to pursue justice regardless of the political consequences. More significantly, Ragnok confirmed that Goblin law provided mechanisms for challenging wrongful imprisonment that operated independently of wizarding government procedures. The legal framework that Ragnok outlined offered hope not just for Sirius's eventual freedom, but for broader reforms that could prevent similar injustices in the future. Goblin courts had jurisdiction over matters involving financial crimes, contractual disputes, and violations of ancient magical laws that predated modern wizarding government. Dumbledore's manipulation of the Potter inheritance, his breach of guardianship contracts, and his interference with legitimate magical protections all fell within Goblin legal authority. More importantly, Goblin legal proceedings were conducted according to standards that prioritized evidence over political influence. Dumbledore's reputation and connections couldn't protect him in Goblin courts, which operated according to principles of strict justice rather than political convenience. The evidence Harry had assembled, combined with the Goblin's own investigation results, would be sufficient to secure not just financial restitution, but criminal sanctions that could strip Dumbledore of his authority and prevent future victims. But the most significant aspect of Ragnok's response was his revelation that other parties had begun investigating Dumbledore independently. The Goblin Intelligence Network had detected inquiries from various sources, suggesting that Harry's case was part of a broader pattern of suspicious activity that was finally attracting official attention. The prospect of joining forces with other Dumbledore opponents offered possibilities that went far beyond Harry's personal quest for justice. A coordinated campaign involving multiple victims, institutional allies like the Goblins, and potentially sympathetic government officials could achieve systemic changes that would benefit countless future victims while ensuring that Dumbledore faced consequences proportionate to his crimes. Harry's strategic thinking had evolved considerably since his first discovery of the hidden documents. He now understood that achieving justice required more than simply exposing individual crimes. It demanded building coalitions capable of challenging entrenched power structures and creating lasting reforms. The boy who had begun this journey, seeking only to understand his own situation, now found himself positioned to lead efforts that could transform the entire wizarding world's approach to child protection and institutional accountability. The training regimen that Harry established for himself reflected his growing understanding of the challenges ahead. Using techniques described in his father's journal, he began developing magical abilities that would serve him well in the conflicts to come. The exercises were demanding, and sometimes dangerous for someone his age, but Harry's determination and unusual magical strength allowed him to make progress that would have impressed experienced instructors. More importantly, Harry began developing the political skills necessary to navigate the complex relationships and competing interests that characterized wizarding society. His interactions with the goblins had taught him valuable lessons about negotiation, alliance building, and strategic communication that would serve him well as his campaign expanded to include other potential allies. The boy's relationship with the Dursleys underwent a fundamental shift as Harry stopped pretending to be the broken victim they expected and began asserting his legitimate authority over his own life. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet confidence that made clear he was no longer afraid of their threats or dependent on their approval. Vernon and Petunia's reactions to Harry's transformation revealed their own understanding of how precarious their position had become. The financial arrangements that had made Harry's abuse profitable for them were clearly dependent on Dumbledore's continued authority and Harry's continued ignorance. With both conditions no longer guaranteed, their cooperation could no longer be assumed. Harry's final conversation with his aunt proved particularly illuminating, as Petunia revealed details about her sister's relationship with Dumbledore that cast the headmaster's manipulation in an even more sinister light. Lily Potter had trusted Dumbledore completely, viewing him as a mentor and father figure whose wisdom could be relied upon in even the most desperate circumstances. Her faith in the old wizard had made her vulnerable to manipulations that she never suspected until it was too late to protect either herself or her son. The tragedy of his parents' situation, trusting the very person who was orchestrating their destruction, provided Harry with crucial insights into Dumbledore's methods and psychology. The headmaster's power rested not on force or obvious coercion, but on his ability to appear benevolent while pursuing a agenda that served his interests rather than those of his supposed beneficiaries. Understanding this pattern allowed Harry to begin planning countermeasures that would expose Dumbledore's true nature while building support for reforms that could prevent similar manipulations in the future. The campaign for Sirius's freedom was just the beginning of a larger effort to hold powerful figures accountable for their actions and ensure that victims of institutional manipulation received both justice and protection. Harry's letter to Sirius, written now with full knowledge of his godfather's innocence and the scope of the conspiracy against both of them, was very different from his earlier attempts at communication. This wasn't a plea for help from a desperate child, but an offer of alliance from someone who possessed both the evidence and the resources necessary to achieve their mutual goals. The letter detailed Harry's discoveries and his alliance with the goblins, while outlining a comprehensive plan for challenging Sirius's imprisonment through legal channels that Dumbledore couldn't control or suppress. More importantly, it offered Sirius the opportunity to participate in a broader campaign for justice that would address not just their personal grievances, but the systemic problems that had made their suffering possible. As Harry sealed the letter and prepared it for delivery through goblin channels, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that first desperate night when blood magic had revealed the truth about his situation. The frightened, broken child who had pressed his bleeding hand against a cupboard wall was gone, replaced by someone who understood both his own power and the responsibilities that came with it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation expanded and more allies joined the cause of justice. But tonight, Harry Potter went to sleep, knowing that he had moved beyond simply seeking personal vindication to leading efforts that could transform the wizarding world for the better. The boy who had been systematically betrayed and abused was becoming the man who would ensure that such betrayals never happened again. The transformation of Harry Potter from victim to strategic operator required more than simply understanding the scope of the conspiracy against him. It demanded the methodical construction of an unassailable case that could withstand the political pressure and institutional manipulation that had protected Dumbledore for decades. Harry's approach to building this case reflected both his natural intelligence and the harsh lessons learned through years of surviving in an environment where any mistake could bring severe consequences. The first challenge was organizing the evidence he had accumulated into a coherent narrative that would be compelling to audiences ranging from goblin bankers to ministry officials who might never have questioned Dumbledore's actions. Harry's discoveries spanned financial fraud, child abuse, wrongful imprisonment, and potentially murder. But presenting these crimes as interconnected parts of a larger conspiracy required careful documentation and strategic presentation. Harry established his evidence organization system using techniques borrowed from his observations of Vernon's business practices, adapted for the unique requirements of exposing magical crimes. Each piece of evidence was catalogued by type, date, and relevance to specific criminal charges, with copies made and stored in multiple secure locations to prevent loss or tampering. The system was designed to be comprehensible to adults who might not initially believe that a 7-year-old could have uncovered such extensive corruption. The blood-warded compartment in his cupboard served as the primary archive, but Harry had learned from Dumbledore's own methods that single points of failure invited catastrophic loss. Additional copies of crucial documents were secured with Mrs. Fig, whose goblin contacts provided storage solutions that combined magical protection with physical security. The most critical evidence was deposited with Gringotts itself, where even Dumbledore's considerable influence couldn't reach. But documentation alone wouldn't be sufficient to challenge someone of Dumbledore's stature and connections. Harry needed witnesses, people who could provide testimony that corroborated his evidence and demonstrated the conspiracy's impact on real lives. The challenge was identifying potential allies who possessed relevant knowledge, but weren't so deeply implicated in Dumbledore's schemes that they couldn't be trusted or wouldn't be dismissed as biased. Mrs. Fig's transformation from unwitting accomplice to active ally proved more significant than Harry had initially anticipated. Her years of observing Harry's treatment while reporting to Dumbledore had left her with detailed knowledge of both the abuse itself and the headmaster's specific instructions for maintaining it. More importantly, her growing horror at realizing her own complicity in systematic child abuse made her a powerful witness whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. The elderly woman's network of contacts within the magical community provided Harry with his first insights into how extensively Dumbledore's influence reached and where vulnerabilities might exist. Mrs. Fig's friends and acquaintances included people who had worked with Dumbledore in various capacities over the decades, and their casual conversations revealed patterns of questionable decisions that individually seemed like honest mistakes, but collectively suggested deliberate manipulation. Harry's approach to recruiting these potential allies required subtlety that went far beyond his years. He couldn't simply approach strangers with accusations against one of the wizarding world's most respected figures, but he could present evidence in ways that allowed people to reach their own conclusions about Dumbledore's true nature. The key was providing enough information to raise questions while leaving people feeling like they were discovering the truth rather than being told what to think. The breakthrough came when Harry learned about Andromeda Tonks through Mrs. Fig's casual mention of a young woman whose family had been torn apart by the war against Voldemort. Andromeda had lost both her husband and her connection to her birth family due to the conflict, leaving her isolated, but potentially sympathetic to others who had suffered from the powerful figures who claimed to represent justice and order. Harry's initial contact with Andromeda was carefully orchestrated through Mrs. Fig's social connections, presented as a chance meeting rather than a deliberate recruitment effort. The conversation that followed revealed someone whose sharp intelligence and deep understanding of wizarding politics made her both a valuable ally and a dangerous person to deceive. Andromeda's questions about Harry's knowledge and circumstances were probing but not hostile, suggesting someone who suspected that standard explanations didn't account for obvious inconsistencies. The decision to trust Andromeda with edited versions of his discoveries proved remarkably liberating for Harry. For the first time since beginning his investigation, he could discuss complex evidence with someone who possessed both the knowledge to understand its implications and the independence to act on that understanding. Andromeda's reactions to Harry's revelations confirmed their significance, while providing crucial context about how they would be received by different audiences within the magical community. More importantly, Andromeda possessed connections to people who had their own reasons to question Dumbledore's methods and motivations. Her late husband's family had served in various government positions, giving her insights into ministry politics and potential allies among officials who might be persuaded to take action if presented with sufficient evidence. Her knowledge of pure-blood family dynamics provided strategic intelligence about how different groups within wizarding society might respond to revelations about Dumbledore's manipulation. The expansion of Harry's alliance network accelerated as word of his investigation began to circulate through discreet channels within the magical community. The key was maintaining operational security while building momentum, ensuring that Dumbledore couldn't simply suppress the investigation through his usual methods of political pressure and character assassination. Each new ally brought additional evidence, broader perspectives, and increased protection against retaliation. Harry's magical training intensified during this period, guided by instructions found in his father's journal and supplemented by discreet advice from his growing network of allies. The exercises went far beyond simple spell casting to encompass magical theory, advanced ward construction, and techniques for detecting and countering mental manipulation. The training was demanding and sometimes dangerous for someone Harry's age, but his unusual magical strength and fierce determination allowed him to make progress that impressed even experienced practitioners. The development of Harry's magical abilities served multiple purposes beyond simple self-protection. Each demonstration of advanced capability reinforced his credibility with potential allies who might otherwise dismiss him as simply a manipulated child repeating adult accusations. More importantly, his growing power made clear that suppressing him through conventional methods would be increasingly difficult, forcing Dumbledore to respond in ways that might expose the headmaster's true nature. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's magical development was revealing connections between his abilities and the protective magic his mother had used to save his life. The blood wards that had hidden his evidence seemed to resonate with his growing power, becoming stronger and more sophisticated as his understanding of their principles improved. This suggested that Harry possessed inherited capabilities that went beyond simple magical strength to encompass protective magic that even Dumbledore might not fully understand or be able to counter. The investigation's expansion beyond Harry's personal grievances began to reveal the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation over the decades. Financial irregularities in other family accounts, questionable decisions that had resulted in unnecessary deaths during the war, and a pattern of placing vulnerable children in situations that served political purposes rather than their own interests. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had used his reputation for benevolence to pursue a agenda that consistently sacrificed individual welfare for supposed greater goods. Ragnarok's reports from the Goblin investigation provided crucial corroboration for Harry's discoveries, while revealing additional crimes that hadn't been immediately apparent from the documents in the blood-warded compartment. The unauthorized financial transactions were just the most visible aspect of a comprehensive system of control that encompassed everything from educational opportunities to marriage arrangements for families whose resources Dumbledore sought to influence. The Goblin banker's growing outrage at the scope of the financial manipulation reflected broader concerns within the Goblin community about wizarding government oversight and accountability. Dumbledore's crimes weren't simply individual acts of theft, but systematic violations of agreements and treaties that governed relations between different magical communities. The political implications extended far beyond punishment for past crimes to encompass fundamental questions about institutional authority and the rule of law. Harry's role in these broader discussions evolved as his understanding of wizarding politics became more sophisticated. The boy who had initially sought simply to understand his own situation now found himself contributing to strategic planning for reforms that could prevent similar abuses in the future. His unique perspective as both a victim of institutional manipulation and someone with access to extensive evidence made his insights valuable to allies who possessed political experience but lacked direct knowledge of Dumbledore's methods. The relationship dynamics within Harry's expanding alliance network required careful management, as different participants brought varying motivations and capabilities to the common cause. Mrs. Figg's guilt over her unwitting complicity provided powerful motivation, but also emotional volatility that needed to be channeled constructively. Andromeda's political sophistication made her invaluable for strategic planning, but her personal losses sometimes led to calls for vengeance that could undermine legal approaches to achieving justice. The goblins brought institutional resources and legal expertise that were crucial for mounting effective challenges to Dumbledore's authority, but their primary interests focused on financial crimes and treaty violations rather than the human costs of the headmaster's manipulation. Balancing these different priorities while maintaining alliance cohesion required diplomatic skills that Harry was developing through necessity rather than formal training. Harry's strategic thinking during this period reflected his growing understanding that achieving justice required more than simply exposing Dumbledore's crimes. The evidence needed to be presented in ways that would compel action from institutions and individuals who had previously been content to accept the headmaster's reputation at face value. This meant crafting narratives that were both emotionally compelling and legally sound, backed by evidence that couldn't be dismissed through the usual techniques of misdirection and character assassination. The challenge of maintaining secrecy while building political momentum required increasingly sophisticated operational security as the investigation expanded. Dumbledore's intelligence network within the wizarding community was extensive, and any premature revelation of the conspiracy against him could result in evidence destruction, witness intimidation, or worse. Harry's allies needed to coordinate their activities without revealing the full scope of their cooperation until they were ready to move decisively. The breakthrough that transformed the investigation from evidence gathering to active legal challenge came when Andromeda discovered government records that confirmed Harry's suspicions about Sirius Black's imprisonment. The ministry files revealed that Black had never received a trial, despite legal requirements that should have guaranteed such proceedings regardless of the apparent evidence against him. More damaging still, the files showed that Dumbledore had been consulted about the decision and had specifically recommended against formal legal proceedings that might have revealed exonerating evidence. This discovery provided the foundation for direct legal challenges that could be mounted through both Goblin and Wizarding court systems. Sirius's wrongful imprisonment violated multiple legal frameworks, creating opportunities for allied advocates to pursue justice through channels that Dumbledore couldn't simply suppress through political influence. The case could serve as a wedge for broader investigations while demonstrating the conspiracy's impact on specific individuals whose suffering couldn't be dismissed as acceptable collateral damage. Harry's preparation of the formal legal documentation required assistance from his adult allies, but reflected his own growing sophistication in understanding how evidence could be presented to achieve maximum impact. Each allegation was carefully supported with multiple sources of evidence, cross-referenced with official records and witness testimony in ways that would make denial or misdirection increasingly difficult. The documents Harry prepared went beyond simple criminal accusations to encompass civil claims for damages that would strip Dumbledore of resources while providing restitution to his victims. The financial aspects of the case were particularly strong, given the Goblin banking records that provided clear evidence of unauthorized transactions and treaty violations. But the human elements of the case, particularly the systematic child abuse and wrongful imprisonment, provided moral authority that would be crucial for building public support. As the legal challenges moved toward formal filing, Harry found himself at the center of alliance planning that would determine not just his own future, but the direction of broader reforms within Wizarding society. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy in a blood-warded compartment was now coordinating efforts that could transform institutional accountability and individual rights throughout the magical world. The final phase of evidence preparation required Harry to make strategic decisions about timing and presentation that would influence how the revelations were received by different audiences. Too rapid an escalation might allow Dumbledore to respond effectively, but excessive caution could permit the destruction of evidence or the intimidation of witnesses. The balance between thoroughness and urgency required judgment that went far beyond Harry's chronological age, but reflected hard-earned understanding of institutional manipulation and political power. Harry's personal transformation during this period was visible to everyone who interacted with him regularly. The defeated, desperate child who had pressed bleeding hands against cupboard walls was gone, replaced by someone who possessed both the knowledge and the determination necessary to challenge even the most powerful figures in his world. More importantly, he had learned to build alliances and coordinate complex efforts while maintaining his integrity and protecting the interests of others who had suffered similar manipulation. The Dursleys' reactions to Harry's obvious changes revealed their growing understanding that their comfortable arrangement was approaching its end. Vernon's increasing nervousness about phone calls from unspecified authorities suggested that he understood the investigation's scope and implications. Petunia's attempts to elicit information about Harry's activities reflected her awareness that the financial benefits of abusing him were no longer guaranteed. But perhaps most significantly, both Dursleys had begun treating Harry with a wary respect that acknowledged his growing capabilities and connections. The boy they had systematically abused and demoralized was clearly no longer powerless, and their future comfort might well depend on his willingness to show mercy rather than pursue complete justice for their years of cruelty. Harry's final letter to Sirius before the legal challenges began reflected his evolution from desperate victim to strategic leader. The communication outlined not just the evidence against Dumbledore and the plans for securing Sirius's freedom, but a broader vision for reforms that could prevent similar injustices in the future. It was the letter of someone offering partnership in a cause rather than simply seeking rescue from desperate circumstances. As Harry sealed the letter and prepared it for delivery through secure goblin channels, he reflected on how completely his understanding of himself and his world had changed. The frightened child who had discovered hidden documents was gone, replaced by someone who understood both his own power and the responsibilities that came with it. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of direct legal action against Dumbledore, but Harry was ready for whatever challenges that campaign might require. The morning that would forever change the balance of power in the wizarding world began with the kind of mundane routine that had characterized Harry Potter's life for as long as he could remember. Vernon Dursley's thunderous descent down the stairs, Petunia's sharp instructions about breakfast preparation, and Dudley's petulant complaints about insufficient attention all proceeded according to their familiar patterns. But beneath this veneer of suburban normalcy, forces were already in motion that would strip away the comfortable illusions that had protected some of the magical world's most powerful figures. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, formal audit notices were delivered simultaneously to 3 locations that had never before experienced such coordinated legal scrutiny. Gringotts Bank's Department of Magical Account Oversight presented comprehensive documentation of financial irregularities to both the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement and the Wizengamot's Administrative Council, while Goblin legal representatives filed formal charges under treaties that governed interspecies financial relations. The charges were devastating in their scope and precision. Unauthorized access to protected accounts, forgery of legal documents, breach of fiduciary responsibility, and violation of international magical banking agreements created a web of criminal and civil liability that even Dumbledore's considerable political influence couldn't simply dismiss. More importantly, the evidence supporting these charges was documented with the kind of thoroughness that goblins brought to all matters involving their institutional integrity. Harry's role in triggering this legal earthquake remained carefully concealed behind layers of procedural complexity that would take even skilled investigators considerable time to unravel. The boy who had discovered the first evidence of financial manipulation was now safely positioned as a concerned heir seeking clarification of his inheritance rights rather than the architect of a comprehensive challenge to one of the wizarding world's most respected figures. But even as the formal legal processes began their inexorable progress through official channels, Harry was implementing the second phase of his campaign, with timing that reflected months of careful planning. The evidence packages that arrived at key ministry offices that same morning were delivered through channels that ensured they would receive immediate attention from officials who possessed both the authority and the political motivation to act on their contents. Amelia Bones, Director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, received her package through official channels that suggested urgent concern from reliable sources within the magical community. The documentation she found within fundamentally challenged her understanding of cases that had defined her career, particularly the imprisonment of Sirius Black and the circumstances surrounding the Potter family's deaths during the war against Voldemort. The evidence was presented with legal precision that immediately commanded respect from someone with Bones's experience in criminal investigation. Each allegation was supported by multiple sources of documentation, cross-referenced with official records, and accompanied by witness statements that created a compelling narrative of systematic manipulation spanning more than a decade. But perhaps most significantly, the evidence package included materials that only someone with intimate knowledge of the crimes could have provided. Financial records that showed clear patterns of unauthorized access, correspondence that revealed deliberate coordination between supposedly independent parties, and magical evidence that demonstrated premeditation in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, received his package through channels that reflected the complex political considerations surrounding any challenge to Dumbledore's authority. The delivery method suggested sources within the magical community who possessed significant influence but preferred to remain anonymous, adding weight to allegations that might otherwise be dismissed as politically motivated attacks on a respected figure. The minister's reaction to the evidence revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his political position. Fudge understood immediately that the allegations, if proven true, would create a crisis that could destabilize the entire magical government. But he also recognized that suppressing such serious charges without investigation would create even greater political risks if the evidence eventually became public through other channels. More importantly, several members of the Wizengamot received their own copies of the evidence through discrete channels that suggested broad concern within the magical community's leadership. The coordinated delivery ensured that any attempt to suppress the investigation would require cooperation from multiple independent officials, making successful cover-up far more difficult to achieve. The immediate response from Dumbledore's allies within the ministry revealed both the extent of his political influence and the limits of what that influence could achieve when confronted with comprehensive evidence of serious crimes. Initial attempts to dismiss the allegations as politically motivated attacks quickly foundered when the supporting documentation proved too substantial to be ignored. But it was Dumbledore's personal response to the crisis that demonstrated both his political sophistication and his fundamental miscalculation of the forces arrayed against him. Rather than attempting to deny the allegations or challenge the evidence directly, the headmaster chose to position himself as the victim of a coordinated attack by enemies who sought to undermine his efforts to protect the magical community. The strategy was characteristically subtle, relying on Dumbledore's reputation for benevolence and his supporters' unwillingness to believe that someone who had opposed Voldemort could be capable of the systematic manipulation described in the evidence. But this approach required maintaining control over the narrative in ways that the coordinated legal challenges made increasingly difficult. Harry's first direct confrontation with Dumbledore came not through his own initiative, but as a result of the headmaster's decision to visit Privet Drive in response to the crisis that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. The old wizard's arrival at Number 4 during the early afternoon created exactly the kind of dramatic confrontation that Harry had been preparing for since his first discovery of the hidden documents. Dumbledore's appearance was carefully calculated to reinforce his image as a concerned mentor, seeking to protect a vulnerable child from manipulation by adults with questionable motives. His grandfatherly demeanor, his expressions of worry about Harry's welfare, and his gentle questions about who might have been influencing the boy's understanding of his situation all followed patterns that had proven effective in previous situations requiring damage control. But Harry's response to this familiar manipulation revealed how completely his perspective had changed since their last interaction. The boy who had once been desperate for adult approval and protection now possessed both the knowledge and the confidence necessary to engage Dumbledore as an equal rather than a supplicant seeking guidance. The conversation began with Dumbledore's customary pleasantries, expressions of concern about Harry's development and welfare that were designed to re-establish his authority as the caring adult responsible for the boy's best interests. But Harry's responses demonstrated understanding that went far beyond what Dumbledore had anticipated, revealing knowledge of financial improprieties and legal violations that should have remained hidden from someone of Harry's age and circumstances. More significantly, Harry's manner during the conversation reflected a confidence and sophistication that contrasted sharply with the broken, grateful victim that Dumbledore's plans required. The boy spoke with the authority of someone who understood both his legal rights and his political position, making demands rather than requests, and setting conditions rather than accepting whatever arrangements adults chose to impose upon him. The turning point in their confrontation came when Harry presented Dumbledore with copies of the evidence that had been delivered to ministry officials, making clear that the headmaster's attempts at damage control had come too late to prevent official investigation. The document spread across the Dursleys' dining room table created a visual representation of the conspiracy's scope that even Dumbledore couldn't dismiss or explain away. Harry's presentation of the evidence was methodical and devastating, building from financial irregularities through systematic child abuse to the orchestrated deaths of his parents and the wrongful imprisonment of his godfather. Each revelation was supported by documentation that Dumbledore recognized as authentic, creating a comprehensive indictment that challenged every aspect of the headmaster's carefully constructed public image. But perhaps most damaging was Harry's demonstration of the magical protections that had preserved the evidence, despite Dumbledore's considerable power and influence. The blood wards that had hidden the initial documents responded to Harry's commands in ways that made clear his growing mastery of protective magic, suggesting capabilities that the headmaster had neither anticipated nor prepared to counter. Dumbledore's attempt to use memory modification spells on Harry provided the final confirmation of everything the boy had suspected about the old wizard's true nature. The casual willingness to violate a child's mind to protect his own interests revealed the moral bankruptcy that had driven decades of manipulation and systematic abuse. Harry's resistance to the memory charms was both instinctive and absolute, drawing on protective magic that seemed to respond to his desperate need to preserve his hard-won understanding of the truth. The spells that should have erased his memories and returned him to compliant victimhood instead rebounded harmlessly, leaving Harry's knowledge intact while demonstrating capabilities that impressed even his experienced opponent. The failure of the memory modification attempts marked Dumbledore's recognition that his usual methods for managing problematic situations would not be sufficient to contain the current crisis. The boy who should have remained ignorant and grateful had instead become a formidable opponent who possessed both evidence of serious crimes and the magical strength necessary to protect that evidence from suppression. Harry's demands during the confrontation reflected both his growing political sophistication and his unwavering commitment to justice for all of Dumbledore's victims. The freedom of Sirius Black was non-negotiable, as was full restitution for the financial theft and comprehensive reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. But Harry also insisted on accountability that went beyond simply correcting past wrongs to encompass consequences that would deter future manipulation. The conversation revealed the fundamental difference in their respective understandings of power and responsibility. Dumbledore viewed his actions as necessary sacrifices made for the greater good, justifying individual suffering as acceptable costs for achieving broader objectives. Harry rejected this utilitarian calculus entirely, insisting that individual rights and dignity could never be sacrificed for supposed collective benefits. More importantly, Harry demonstrated understanding of institutional accountability that went far beyond his chronological age, demanding systemic changes that would prevent future victims rather than simply seeking personal vindication. His vision for reforms encompassed everything from financial oversight to child protection services, creating frameworks that would make similar manipulation far more difficult to achieve. Dumbledore's final gambit involved attempting to position Harry's actions as dangerous to the magical community's stability, arguing that exposing institutional weaknesses would create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. But this argument failed to acknowledge that the existing system's corruption had already created those vulnerabilities, making reform a matter of security rather than risk. Harry's rejection of this argument was both principled and practical, pointing out that institutions that couldn't withstand scrutiny were already compromised, and that transparency was the only reliable foundation for genuine security. His response demonstrated understanding of governance principles that many adult wizards had never considered, reflecting education that had come through necessity rather than formal instruction. The confrontation's conclusion left both participants with clear understanding of their respective positions and the inevitable conflict that lay ahead. Dumbledore could no longer maintain the illusion that Harry remained under his control, while Harry had demonstrated both his determination to pursue justice and his capability to withstand attempts at intimidation or manipulation. But perhaps most significantly, the failed memory modification attempts had revealed the extent of Harry's magical development and his growing mastery of protective magic that seemed to operate according to principles that even Dumbledore didn't fully understand. The boy who had been systematically abused and isolated was demonstrating capabilities that suggested his true potential had been deliberately suppressed rather than simply underdeveloped. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation saw Dumbledore's recognition that his traditional methods for managing crises would not be sufficient to contain the current situation. The evidence was already in official hands, the legal challenges were proceeding through multiple channels, and Harry had demonstrated both the knowledge and the capability necessary to resist direct intervention. More importantly, Harry's network of allies had grown beyond the headmaster's ability to suppress through conventional political pressure. The goblins operated according to their own legal frameworks. The ministry officials who had received evidence possessed independent authority, and the broader magical community was beginning to ask questions that couldn't be easily dismissed. Harry's strategic position following the confrontation reflected months of careful preparation and alliance building that had positioned him to survive Dumbledore's inevitable counterattack while maintaining momentum toward achieving justice. The boy had learned from his enemy's methods while rejecting his moral compromises, creating an approach to political conflict that combined effectiveness with integrity. The public nature of Dumbledore's visit to Privet Drive, combined with the obvious tension between the two participants, ensured that word of their conflict would spread throughout the magical community, regardless of official attempts at suppression. Harry had successfully transformed a private conspiracy into a public controversy that would require resolution through legitimate institutions rather than backroom manipulation. The Dursleys' reactions to witnessing the confrontation between their nephew and one of the magical world's most powerful figures revealed their growing understanding of how completely their situation had changed. Vernon and Petunia could no longer assume that their arrangement with Dumbledore would protect them from consequences, particularly given Harry's obvious capabilities and connections. Harry's final statement to Dumbledore made clear that this confrontation was merely the opening move in a broader campaign for justice that would continue regardless of any attempts at intimidation or suppression. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy in a blood-warded compartment was now publicly committed to seeing that conspiracy exposed and its perpetrators held accountable for their crimes. As Dumbledore departed Privet Drive for what both participants understood would be their last meeting as manipulator and victim, Harry reflected on how completely his life had changed since that first desperate night when accidental magic had revealed the truth about his circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal and political battles intensified, but Harry was ready for whatever those challenges might require. The transformation was complete. Harry Potter was no longer Dumbledore's victim, but his opponent, armed with evidence, allies, and capabilities that would allow him to pursue justice regardless of the obstacles that lay ahead. The war for truth and accountability had begun, and Harry intended to win it. The week following Harry's confrontation with Dumbledore brought revelations that transformed not only his understanding of his own magical heritage, but the entire trajectory of the campaign for justice. What had begun as a desperate search for truth about his circumstances had evolved into something far more significant, a comprehensive magical education that revealed capabilities Harry had never suspected he possessed. The goblin specialists who arrived at Mrs. Fig's house 3 days after the confrontation came bearing instruments and expertise that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about magical assessment and development. Ragnarok had insisted that Harry undergo formal testing, not simply to satisfy curiosity about his abilities, but because understanding the full scope of his magical potential was crucial for both his protection and the broader success of their legal campaign. Harry's initial reaction to the proposed testing reflected the wariness that years of abuse had instilled in him regarding any situation where adults claimed to know what was best for his development. But the goblin's approach was fundamentally different from the manipulation and control he had experienced from wizarding authorities. They explained their procedures in detail, obtained his informed consent for each phase of testing, and made clear that the results would belong to Harry rather than being used to justify decisions made by others about his future. The testing itself revealed magical capabilities that concerned even the experienced goblin practitioners conducting the assessment. Harry's raw power levels were extraordinary for someone his age, suggesting potential that rivaled some of the most gifted wizards in recorded magical history. But more significantly, his magical development showed evidence of systematic suppression that had been maintained through external intervention rather than natural limitation. Griphook's analysis of the test results painted a disturbing picture of deliberate magical stunting that went far beyond simple neglect. The patterns of suppression were too precise and sustained to be accidental, suggesting ongoing intervention designed to limit Harry's development while maintaining the appearance of normal childhood magical manifestation. Someone with considerable knowledge and skill had been actively working to prevent Harry from realizing his true potential. The implications were staggering and deeply personal. Harry's years of believing himself to be moderately talented at best, his struggles with even basic magical concepts, and his sense of inadequacy compared to his parents' legacy had all been artificially imposed rather than reflecting his natural abilities. The systematic suppression had robbed him not only of his magical development, but of his confidence and understanding of his own worth. But perhaps most significantly, the testing revealed that Harry had begun to overcome this artificial limitation through his own efforts and determination. The blood magic that had revealed the hidden documents, the protective wards that had shielded his evidence from Dumbledore's attempts at suppression, and his resistance to memory modification all reflected natural capabilities that were asserting themselves despite years of systematic interference. The goblin specialists were particularly intrigued by Harry's apparent mastery of protective magic, abilities that seemed to operate according to principles that predated modern magical theory. The blood wards that had hidden his evidence weren't simply inherited protections from his mother's sacrifice, but active magical constructs that Harry was unconsciously maintaining and strengthening through his own power and will. Ragnarok's explanation of these discoveries introduced Harry to magical concepts and traditions that weren't taught in modern wizarding schools, but represented some of the oldest and most powerful forms of magical practice. The Potter family, it seemed, had possessed hereditary connections to protective magic that stretched back centuries, abilities that had been systematically suppressed or ignored by recent generations in favor of more conventional magical education. The goblin grimoire that Ragnok presented to Harry contained centuries of accumulated knowledge about protective magic, ward construction, and magical theory that had been preserved by the Goblin Nation when wizard authorities had deemed such knowledge too dangerous or primitive for general study. The text was written in multiple languages and magical scripts, requiring significant effort to master, but it represented a complete magical education that operated independently of wizard institutional control. Harry's first attempts at the exercises described in the grimoire produced results that exceeded even Ragnok's optimistic expectations. The boy who had struggled with basic levitation charms under the Dursleys' suppression was now demonstrating mastery of complex ward structures and protective magic that typically required years of advanced study. His natural affinity for this type of magic was remarkable, suggesting inherited abilities that had been waiting for proper guidance and development. But the magical training was only one aspect of Harry's accelerating education during this crucial period. His growing network of allies provided access to political knowledge and strategic thinking that complemented his expanding magical capabilities. Andromeda Tonks proved particularly valuable in this regard, offering insights into wizarding society's power structures and the complex relationships that governed political decision-making. Andromeda's analysis of the Ministry's response to the evidence packages revealed both encouraging progress and significant obstacles that would need to be overcome to achieve lasting justice. Officials like Amelia Bones were conducting serious investigations that couldn't easily be suppressed, but Dumbledore's political influence remained substantial enough to complicate efforts at institutional accountability. More importantly, Andromeda identified potential allies within the magical community who possessed both the influence and the motivation to support comprehensive reforms. Many pure blood families who had opposed Voldemort during the war harbored their own suspicions about Dumbledore's methods and decision-making, creating opportunities for building broader coalitions that could survive individual political pressures. The expansion of Harry's political education included intensive study of wizarding law, governmental procedures, and the complex web of relationships that connected different magical institutions. This knowledge proved crucial for understanding not only how the current system had enabled Dumbledore's manipulation, but how systematic reforms could be implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future. Harry's relationship with the broader magical community began to evolve as word of his investigation spread through discreet channels within Wizarding Society. The boy who had been completely isolated from his heritage was now positioned as a potential leader in efforts to reform institutions that had failed multiple generations of magical children. His unique combination of victimization, evidence, and growing capabilities made him a compelling figure for those who sought change. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's story was beginning to encourage other victims of institutional manipulation to come forward with their own experiences. Letters began arriving through goblin channels from individuals who had suffered under systems that prioritized political convenience over individual welfare, creating a broader movement that could sustain reforms even if attempts were made to suppress Harry's specific case. The political ramifications extended far beyond the wizarding community's borders as goblin representatives began raising concerns about treaty violations and institutional accountability with international magical authorities. Dumbledore's manipulation of financial systems and legal procedures had created diplomatic problems that couldn't be resolved through domestic political maneuvering alone. Harry's role in these expanding political dynamics required sophisticated understanding of alliance building and strategic communication that went far beyond his chronological age, but reflected hard-earned wisdom about power structures and institutional manipulation. His meetings with various community leaders and political figures demonstrated remarkable poise and strategic thinking that impressed even experienced practitioners of wizarding politics. The challenge of balancing his growing public profile with the security requirements of ongoing legal proceedings required careful coordination with his allies and advisors. Harry needed to remain visible enough to maintain political momentum while avoiding exposure that could compromise investigations or invite retaliation from Dumbledore's remaining supporters. The magical community's response to Harry's emergence as a political figure revealed deep divisions that had been suppressed beneath surface unity during the war against Voldemort. Some elements embraced his calls for institutional accountability and individual rights, while others worried that challenging established authorities could destabilize the magical world's carefully maintained order. These political tensions came to a head during Harry's first formal appearance before a gathering of influential wizarding families, an event that had been carefully orchestrated by his allies to introduce him to potential supporters while demonstrating his growing capabilities and political sophistication. The meeting took place at a neutral location that provided security while accommodating the various political and social requirements of the attendees. Harry's presentation to this gathering represented his first major test as a public advocate for institutional reform and individual rights. His speech needed to be sophisticated enough to command respect from experienced political figures while remaining authentic to his age and personal experiences. More importantly, it needed to articulate a vision for reform that went beyond simply correcting past wrongs to encompass systemic changes that could prevent future victims. The response to Harry's presentation exceeded even his most optimistic expectations, with several influential families offering both material support and political endorsement for the broader reform campaign. More significantly, representatives from international magical communities expressed interest in supporting efforts to establish stronger institutional accountability and individual protections throughout the magical world. But the meeting also revealed the extent of opposition that Harry and his allies would face as the campaign progressed. Dumbledore's supporters, while fewer in number than previously assumed, included individuals with significant resources and institutional influence who were prepared to defend their interests through whatever means proved necessary. The threats that emerged from these opposition forces required immediate attention to security measures that went beyond simple physical protection to encompass magical defenses and political countermeasures. Harry's growing capabilities in protective magic proved crucial for maintaining his safety while continuing his public advocacy, but the escalating conflict made clear that the stakes of their campaign extended far beyond individual justice to encompass fundamental questions about magical society's future direction. Harry's training during this period intensified accordingly, with goblin instructors providing advanced education in both offensive and defensive magic that would serve him well in the conflicts ahead. The exercises were demanding and sometimes dangerous, but Harry's natural abilities and fierce determination allowed him to make progress that impressed even his experienced teachers. The development of Harry's magical capabilities was paralleled by his growing understanding of the political and legal frameworks that would determine the ultimate success or failure of the campaign for justice. His study of precedent cases, institutional procedures, and reform movements throughout magical history provided context for current efforts, while suggesting strategies that could overcome traditional obstacles to systematic change. The discovery of additional evidence during this period came not through Harry's own investigations, but through the network of allies and supporters who had been inspired by his example to examine their own experiences with institutional manipulation. Financial records, correspondence, and witness testimony began flowing through goblin channels, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that extended far beyond Harry's individual case. This expanding evidence base strengthened the legal challenges while complicating the political dynamics surrounding the campaign. Each new revelation of institutional failure created additional momentum for reform, while also increasing the stakes for those whose interests depended on maintaining existing power structures. Harry's personal development during this transformative period reflected his evolution from isolated victim to public advocate and potential leader of broader social change. The boy who had discovered hidden documents in a cupboard was now coordinating complex political and legal strategies while mastering magical abilities that had been systematically suppressed for years. The relationship between Harry's magical development and his growing political influence proved mutually reinforcing, with each area of growth strengthening his capabilities in the other. His expanding magical abilities provided credibility and protection that enhanced his political effectiveness, while his political knowledge and alliance networks created opportunities for advanced magical education that wouldn't have been available through traditional channels. The international attention that Harry's case was beginning to attract represented both opportunity and risk for the broader reform campaign. Support from foreign magical communities could provide resources and legitimacy that domestic opposition would find difficult to counter, but it also raised stakes that could invite more serious retaliation from those whose interests were threatened by systematic change. Harry's preparation for the next phase of the campaign reflected his growing understanding that achieving justice would require not only exposing past crimes, but building institutions capable of preventing future manipulation and abuse. His vision for reform encompassed everything from financial oversight to child protection services, creating comprehensive frameworks that would make similar victimization far more difficult to achieve. The boy who had pressed bleeding hands against cupboard walls in desperate hope of finding truth was now positioned to reshape the fundamental structures of magical society in ways that could benefit countless future generations. The transformation was remarkable, not only in its scope, but in its demonstration that individual courage and determination could challenge even the most entrenched systems of institutional power. As Harry concluded his magical training session and prepared for the political battles ahead, he reflected on how completely his understanding of himself and his world had changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the campaign entered its most crucial phase, but Harry possessed both the capabilities and the allies necessary to pursue justice regardless of the obstacles that lay ahead. The war for truth and accountability was accelerating, and Harry intended to see it through to victory. The formal launch of the Ministry investigation into Sirius Black's imprisonment marked a turning point that transformed Harry's carefully orchestrated campaign from discreet political maneuvering into open institutional warfare. 3 weeks had passed since the evidence packages had reached key ministry officials, and the political pressure that Harry's allies had been building through careful alliance construction was finally compelling official action that could no longer be suppressed through traditional channels. Amelia Bones's decision to personally oversee the Black investigation represented both a victory for Harry's strategic planning and a recognition that the evidence presented demands that went far beyond typical cases of wrongful imprisonment. The Director of Magical Law Enforcement had built her career on meticulous attention to legal procedures and institutional integrity, making her both an ideal advocate for justice and a formidable opponent for anyone who had manipulated the system for personal advantage. The investigation's scope expanded rapidly, as Bones and her team discovered the extent to which proper legal procedures had been ignored or deliberately circumvented in Black's case. The absence of any trial transcript, the lack of witness testimony, and the failure to investigate obvious inconsistencies in the evidence all pointed toward systematic corruption that extended far beyond individual incompetence or administrative error. More damaging still was the discovery that key ministry officials had been explicitly advised against conducting formal proceedings by external authorities who claimed special knowledge about the case's sensitivity and security implications. Dumbledore's role as an advisor in the decision to bypass normal legal procedures created a direct connection between the headmaster and the violations of institutional process that had resulted in an innocent man's imprisonment. Harry's involvement in the investigation remained carefully concealed behind layers of procedural complexity and legal representation that protected him from direct exposure while ensuring that his evidence received proper consideration. The Goblin legal advocates who had been working on his behalf possessed both the expertise and the institutional independence necessary to present his materials in ways that commanded official respect while maintaining operational security. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's first formal testimony under Veritaserum established legal precedent for child advocacy in wizarding law that would have implications far beyond his individual case. The decision to allow a 7-year-old victim to provide sworn testimony about systematic abuse and institutional manipulation represented a fundamental shift in how the magical legal system approached cases involving vulnerable witnesses. The Veritaserum session itself took place in a secure ministry facility, with multiple observers present to ensure both the integrity of the proceedings and Harry's protection from potential retaliation. The truth serum's effects were carefully monitored by qualified professionals who possessed both medical training and legal expertise, creating conditions that would make any challenge to the testimony's validity extremely difficult to sustain. Harry's preparation for the session had been intensive, involving consultation with goblin legal experts who understood both the magical and legal implications of sworn testimony given under truth compulsion. The challenge was presenting his experiences and evidence in ways that would be compelling to ministry officials while maintaining the security of ongoing investigations and protecting the sources who had contributed to his understanding of the broader conspiracy. The testimony itself was devastating in its clarity and comprehensiveness, establishing a timeline of systematic abuse that began with Harry's earliest memories and continued through his recent discoveries about the scope of institutional manipulation that had shaped his entire life. The Veritaserum prevented any attempt at deception or exaggeration, making Harry's account an unassailable foundation for broader investigations into Dumbledore's activities. But perhaps most importantly, Harry's testimony revealed the interconnected nature of various crimes that had previously been viewed as separate incidents of questionable judgment. The financial manipulation, the wrongful imprisonment, the systematic child abuse, and the interference with legitimate magical protections all emerged as components of a coordinated campaign that had been maintained over years through careful political maneuvering and institutional influence. The immediate response from Dumbledore's political allies revealed both the extent of their concern and the limitations of their ability to suppress investigations that had gained official momentum. Initial attempts to challenge Harry's testimony on grounds of age and competence quickly foundered when the Veritaserum evidence proved impossible to dispute through conventional legal arguments. More sophisticated efforts focused on questioning the motivations of those who had encouraged Harry to come forward with his allegations, suggesting that the boy was being manipulated by adults with political agenda that went beyond simple justice for past wrongs. But these arguments struggled to explain the comprehensive nature of Harry's evidence, or the independent corroboration that was emerging from multiple sources. The political complexity of the situation was further complicated by the involvement of Lucius Malfoy, whose interest in the proceedings reflected opportunities to damage Dumbledore while appearing to support justice and institutional reform. Malfoy's resources and connections within the ministry created additional pressure for thorough investigation, while also raising questions about the motivations driving various participants in the broader political struggle. Harry's strategic response to Malfoy's involvement demonstrated remarkable sophistication for someone his age, recognizing both the potential benefits and risks of accepting support from sources whose ultimate objectives might not align with his own principles. The alliance that developed was carefully structured to advance Harry's goals while limiting opportunities for manipulation by parties whose interests in reform were primarily tactical rather than genuine. The broader political dynamics surrounding the investigation revealed deep divisions within wizarding society that had been suppressed beneath surface unity during the recent war against Voldemort. Many families who had supported the war effort harbored private concerns about Dumbledore's methods and decision-making, creating opportunities for building coalitions that could sustain reform efforts, even if individual political pressures shifted. Harry's role in navigating these complex political relationships required understanding that went far beyond his chronological age, but reflected hard-earned wisdom about institutional power and the motivations that drove adult behavior in systems where individual welfare was often subordinated to political convenience. His ability to maintain principled positions while building practical alliances impressed even experienced political observers. The investigation's expansion beyond Sirius Black's case began to reveal patterns of institutional manipulation that extended throughout the recent war period and into the current administration's policies. Financial irregularities in multiple family accounts, questionable decisions that had resulted in unnecessary casualties, and systematic efforts to concentrate power in the hands of a small group of connected individuals all emerged as subjects for official scrutiny. The scope of these discoveries created both opportunities and risks for Harry's broader reform agenda. Each new revelation strengthened the case for systematic institutional change, while also increasing the stakes for those whose interests depended on maintaining existing power structures. The expanding investigation was generating momentum that could prove difficult to control, even by those who had initiated it. Harry's personal development during this crucial period reflected his evolution from individual victim seeking justice to strategic leader of broader social change. His meetings with ministry officials, his coordination with legal advocates, and his public appearances all demonstrated capabilities that commanded respect from experienced practitioners of wizarding politics. The magical community's response to Harry's emergence as a reform advocate revealed the extent to which institutional failures had affected multiple generations of magical citizens. Letters of support arrived through goblin channels from families who had suffered under systems that prioritized political stability over individual rights, creating a groundswell of public opinion that was becoming increasingly difficult for traditional authorities to ignore. But perhaps most significantly, the investigation was beginning to attract international attention as foreign magical communities recognized the broader implications of institutional accountability and individual protection. Representatives from various magical governments expressed interest in the precedents being established, suggesting that reforms achieved in Britain could influence similar efforts throughout the magical world. The legal framework that was emerging from the investigation created new protections for vulnerable individuals while establishing procedures for challenging institutional decisions that affected individual rights and welfare. These developments represented fundamental changes in how magical society approached questions of authority and accountability, changes that would have lasting impact regardless of the specific outcomes in individual cases. Harry's strategic planning during this period reflected his growing understanding that achieving lasting reform required more than simply exposing past crimes or securing justice for individual victims. The institutional changes that were being implemented needed to be comprehensive enough to prevent future manipulation, while sustainable enough to survive changes in political leadership and public attention. The child protection framework that emerged from Harry's case established new standards for investigating allegations of institutional abuse while creating mechanisms for independent oversight that operated outside traditional political structures. These reforms were designed to prevent the kind of systematic victimization that Harry had endured while ensuring that future cases would receive proper attention, regardless of the political connections of potential perpetrators. The financial oversight mechanisms that resulted from the Goblin investigation created stronger protections for family inheritance, while establishing clearer procedures for challenging unauthorized transactions. These changes addressed not only the specific crimes committed against the Potter estate, but broader patterns of financial manipulation that had affected multiple families throughout the magical community. But perhaps most importantly, the legal precedents established through Harry's testimony and the subsequent investigations created frameworks for individual advocacy that could be applied to future cases involving institutional manipulation and abuse. The principle that individual rights could not be sacrificed for supposed collective benefits was becoming embedded in magical law in ways that would be difficult for future authorities to reverse. The political ramifications of these changes extended far beyond the immediate participants in Harry's case, influencing ongoing debates about governmental authority and individual freedom throughout magical society. The reforms that had emerged from one boy's desperate search for truth were beginning to reshape fundamental assumptions about power and responsibility that had governed wizarding politics for generations. Harry's relationship with the broader magical community continued to evolve as his role in driving institutional change became more widely understood. The boy who had been completely isolated from his heritage was now positioned as a symbol of individual courage and institutional accountability that inspired others to challenge systems that had previously seemed immutable. The opposition that had emerged in response to these changes revealed both the extent of resistance to reform and the vulnerabilities of those whose interests depended on maintaining existing power structures. Dumbledore's remaining supporters found themselves defending increasingly indefensible positions as evidence of systematic manipulation became impossible to deny or dismiss. The international dimension of the reform movement created additional pressure for comprehensive change, while also providing protection for Harry and his allies against potential retaliation from domestic opponents. Support from foreign magical communities made suppression of the investigation politically impossible, while creating opportunities for collaboration on broader reform initiatives. Harry's preparation for the next phase of the campaign reflected his understanding that the investigation's success had created new responsibilities and opportunities that extended far beyond his initial goals of personal justice and institutional accountability. The movement that had grown from his individual case was now positioned to achieve systematic changes that could benefit countless future generations. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy in a blood-warded compartment was now leading efforts to transform the fundamental structures of magical society in ways that prioritized individual rights and institutional transparency. The investigation had revealed not only the scope of past manipulation, but the possibilities for future reform that could prevent similar victimization while creating stronger protections for vulnerable individuals. As Harry concluded his testimony and prepared for the continued expansion of the investigation, he reflected on how completely his understanding of justice and institutional responsibility had evolved. The campaign that had begun with desperate questions about his own circumstances had become a comprehensive effort to establish accountability and protection throughout magical society. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as political opposition intensified and the stakes of institutional reform became clearer to all participants. But Harry possessed both the evidence and the allies necessary to pursue lasting change, regardless of the obstacles that lay ahead. The investigation had gained momentum that would be difficult to suppress, and the precedents being established would continue to influence magical society long after current political struggles had been resolved. The official hearing that would determine Sirius Black's fate took place on a grey October morning that seemed to mirror the somberness of the proceedings, yet carried within it the electric tension of long-awaited justice finally within reach. The ancient courtroom deep within the Ministry of Magic had witnessed countless trials throughout its storied history, but few had carried the political weight or personal significance of the case that was about to unfold. Harry Potter sat in the witness section with a composure that belied his 7 years, flanked by goblin legal representatives whose presence served as both protection and symbol of the institutional independence that had made this day possible. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy in a blood-watered compartment was now positioned to witness the vindication of his godfather and the public exposure of the man who had orchestrated both their suffering. The courtroom itself was packed with observers whose presence reflected the case's broader significance for wizarding society. Ministry officials, members of prominent magical families, representatives from international magical communities, and journalists whose coverage would carry news of the proceedings throughout the magical world all crowded into the available seating, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that was almost palpable. Amelia Bones's opening statement established the hearing's scope and significance with characteristic precision, outlining the systematic failures that had resulted in Sirius Black's imprisonment without trial and the broader implications of institutional accountability that the case represented. Her presentation was methodical and devastating, building from procedural violations through evidence tampering to the deliberate suppression of exonerating information that should have prevented the wrongful imprisonment. But it was Harry's testimony that provided the emotional and evidentiary foundation for everything that followed. The boy's appearance at the witness stand created a moment of absolute silence in the courtroom, as even the most hardened political observers recognized the extraordinary nature of a child providing crucial evidence in a case that could reshape institutional accountability throughout the magical world. Harry's account of discovering his father's journal and the evidence of Peter Pettigrew's betrayal was delivered with clarity and precision that commanded respect from even those who had initially questioned whether someone his age could provide reliable testimony in such complex proceedings. The veritaserum that had been administered under strict medical supervision ensured that every word carried the weight of absolute truth, making denial or contradiction impossible. The revelation of Dumbledore's role in orchestrating the secret keeper switch sent shock waves through the courtroom that were visible in the faces of observers who had never questioned the headmaster's wisdom or motivations. Harry's description of his father's growing suspicions about Dumbledore's true agenda, supported by documentary evidence that had been authenticated by multiple independent sources, painted a picture of betrayal that went far beyond simple political miscalculation. More damaging still was Harry's testimony about the deliberate manipulation of legal procedures that had prevented Sirius from receiving the trial that should have revealed his innocence. The evidence showed clear coordination between Dumbledore and Ministry officials who had been persuaded to bypass normal legal protections in the name of security considerations that served political convenience rather than justice. The presentation of Peter Pettigrew's actual location and activities during the period when he was supposed to be dead provided concrete proof of Sirius's innocence that even the most skeptical observers couldn't dismiss. The rat that had lived with the Weasley family for years, documented through magical examination and witness testimony, represented living evidence that the entire case against Sirius had been built on deliberately constructed lies. But perhaps most significantly, Harry's testimony revealed the scope of Dumbledore's manipulation that extended far beyond individual cases to encompass systematic efforts to control information, suppress dissent, and maintain power through the careful orchestration of public perception and institutional procedures. The pattern that emerged was one of calculated betrayal, maintained over years through careful political maneuvering and the exploitation of trust that had been earned through genuine service during darker times. Sirius Black's first public appearance in more than 6 years created an emotional moment that transcended the legal proceedings to touch something fundamental about justice, suffering, and the human cost of institutional failure. The man who had endured years of wrongful imprisonment bore visible signs of his ordeal, but his dignity and determination to see the truth revealed provided powerful testimony to the resilience of the human spirit under even the most terrible circumstances. Sirius's own testimony provided crucial corroboration for Harry's evidence, while adding personal details that made the scope of the conspiracy against them both absolutely clear. His account of the night his best friends died, the betrayal by someone they had trusted completely, and his desperate attempts to prove his innocence through a system that had already decided his guilt created a narrative that was impossible to dismiss or explain away. The reunion between Harry and Sirius that took place during a recess in the proceedings provided both participants with their first opportunity to interact as free individuals rather than victim and wrongfully imprisoned guardian. The emotional complexity of the moment was overwhelming, combining years of separation, systematic abuse, and institutional betrayal with the hope of genuine family connection that had been denied to both of them for so long. Harry's first experience of unconditional family love was complicated by the circumstances that had brought them together and the years of systematic conditioning that had taught him to distrust adult affection as potentially manipulative. But Sirius's obvious genuine care, combined with his understanding of the political sophistication Harry had been forced to develop, created a foundation for relationship that acknowledged both their shared trauma and their individual strength. Sirius's rage upon learning the full extent of Harry's abuse and the systematic nature of Dumbledore's manipulation created tension about the appropriate response to institutional betrayal that went beyond simple criminal prosecution. The man who had spent years in Azkaban, dreaming of revenge against those who had wronged him, now found himself part of a broader movement for justice that required strategic thinking rather than emotional satisfaction. The introduction of Remus Lupin to the proceedings brought additional complexity to the family dynamics while providing crucial testimony about the events leading up to James and Lily Potter's deaths. Lupin's guilt over his failure to investigate Harry's circumstances more thoroughly during the years of wrongful separation created emotional weight that complemented the legal and political significance of the broader case. But Lupin's testimony also revealed the extent to which Dumbledore's manipulation had affected multiple generations of those who had trusted him, isolating potential allies from each other while maintaining central control over information and decision-making. The systematic nature of this manipulation became clear as witness after witness described decisions that had served Dumbledore's agenda while causing unnecessary suffering for those who should have been protected. The legal proceedings against Dumbledore that were announced during the hearing represented the culmination of months of careful investigation and strategic preparation. The charges encompassed fraud, child endangerment, obstruction of justice, and violations of international magical law that created both criminal and civil liability, extending far beyond the specific case of Sirius Black's wrongful imprisonment. The evidence supporting these charges was comprehensive and devastating, drawing on financial records, correspondence, witness testimony, and magical evidence that had been preserved despite years of attempted suppression. The case that emerged was so thoroughly documented and legally sound that even Dumbledore's remaining political allies found it increasingly difficult to maintain their support in the face of overwhelming proof of systematic wrongdoing. Harry's strategic decision to pursue civil remedies in addition to criminal charges reflected his growing understanding of institutional accountability and the need to create consequences that went beyond individual punishment to encompass systemic reform. The financial damages that were being sought would strip Dumbledore of resources while providing restitution to victims. But more importantly, they would establish precedents that could be applied to future cases of institutional manipulation. The broader political implications of the hearing extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass fundamental questions about governmental authority, individual rights, and the mechanisms necessary to prevent future abuses of institutional power. The reforms that were being implemented as a result of Harry's case represented comprehensive changes in how magical society approached questions of accountability and protection for vulnerable individuals. The international attention that the case was receiving created additional pressure for thorough resolution while providing opportunities for collaboration on similar reform efforts throughout the magical world. Representatives from various foreign magical governments expressed interest in implementing comparable protections and oversight mechanisms, suggesting that the precedents being established could have lasting impact far beyond Britain's borders. The courtroom's response to the presentation of evidence revealed the extent to which public opinion had shifted as the scope of institutional manipulation became clear. Observers who had initially been skeptical about challenging such a respected figure as Dumbledore now found themselves confronting undeniable proof of systematic betrayal that demanded accountability, regardless of previous reputation or political connections. But perhaps most significantly, the hearing demonstrated the power of individual courage and determination to challenge even the most entrenched systems of institutional control. Harry's transformation from isolated victim to strategic advocate for broader social change provided inspiration for others who had suffered under systems that prioritized political convenience over individual welfare. The formal exoneration of Sirius Black that concluded the hearing represented not only personal vindication for Harry and his godfather, but symbolic victory for principles of justice and institutional accountability that had been systematically undermined through years of careful manipulation. The moment when Sirius was officially declared innocent and free carried emotional weight that transcended the legal proceedings to touch fundamental questions about truth, justice, and the responsibility of institutions to protect rather than exploit those they claim to serve. The political ramifications of the hearing's outcome were immediately apparent as Dumbledore's support within the Wizengamot began to collapse in the face of undeniable evidence of systematic wrongdoing. The man who had maintained power through careful cultivation of his reputation for benevolence now faced consequences that reflected the scope of his betrayal of public trust. More importantly, the institutional reforms that were being implemented as a direct result of Harry's case created frameworks for accountability and protection that would make similar manipulation far more difficult to achieve in the future. The precedents being established represented fundamental changes in how magical society approached questions of power and responsibility. The child protection services that emerged from the investigation created new standards for monitoring and intervention that operated independently of traditional political structures, ensuring that future cases of institutional abuse would receive proper attention regardless of the political connections of potential perpetrators. These reforms addressed not only Harry's specific situation, but broader patterns of systematic victimization that had affected multiple generations of magical children. The financial oversight mechanisms that resulted from the Goblin investigation established stronger protections for family inheritance while creating clearer procedures for challenging unauthorized transactions. These changes addressed both the specific crimes committed against the Potter estate and similar patterns of financial manipulation that had affected other families throughout the magical community. Harry's role in these broader reforms reflected his evolution from individual victim-seeking personal justice to strategic leader of comprehensive social change. The boy who had discovered evidence of conspiracy was now positioned as a catalyst for institutional transformation that could benefit countless future generations. The reunion celebration that took place after the hearing's conclusion provided Harry and Sirius with their first opportunity to interact as a genuine family, free from the constraints of legal proceedings and institutional manipulation. The complexity of their relationship, shaped by years of separation and systematic abuse, would require time and patience to develop, but the foundation of mutual respect and understanding was clearly established. Sirius's commitment to supporting Harry's continued advocacy for institutional reform reflected his understanding that their personal vindication was part of a broader movement for justice that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. The man who had been wrongfully imprisoned was now positioned to contribute to efforts that could prevent similar injustices in the future. The broader magical community's response to the hearing's outcome revealed deep divisions about the appropriate scope of institutional reform and the balance between individual rights and collective security. But the momentum that had been generated by Harry's case created political pressure for comprehensive change that would be difficult for traditional authorities to suppress or reverse. The international implications of the precedents being established suggested that the reforms achieved in Britain could influence similar efforts throughout the magical world, creating opportunities for collaboration on institutional accountability and individual protection that transcended national boundaries. Harry's preparation for the next phase of his advocacy reflected his growing understanding that achieving lasting change required sustained effort and strategic thinking that went beyond exposing individual cases of wrongdoing to encompass systematic reform of institutional structures and cultural attitudes. The boy who had pressed bleeding hands against cupboard walls in desperate search for truth was now positioned to lead efforts that could transform the fundamental relationship between individuals and institutions throughout magical society. The hearing had demonstrated both the possibility of challenging entrenched power and the necessity of continued vigilance to protect the reforms that had been achieved. As Harry and Sirius left the courtroom together for the first time as free family members, they carried with them not only personal vindication, but responsibility for ensuring that the precedents established through their struggle would continue to protect others who might face similar institutional manipulation and abuse. The hearing had ended, but the broader campaign for justice and accountability was just beginning its most important phase.